Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey back to a time when darkness truly meant something. Imagine this, it is 6 o'clock on a winter evening in 1850. No light switch exists on your wall, no television glows in the corner, no phone buzzes in your pocket. As the sun dips below the horizon, a woman in her kitchen faces a choice that will determine whether her family stays warm, eats dinner, or sits in cold darkness. Her hands reach for kindling. The next 2 hours of her life will revolve entirely around fire. This is not a camping trip, this is not romantic, this is survival. And for women across America and Europe, this moment repeated itself every single evening for thousands of years. What did they do with those long, dark hours? How did they fill the time we now spend scrolling, streaming, and staring at screens? The answer might surprise you. It might even change how you see your own evenings. Before we step into that firelit world together, I need to ask you something. If this story speaks to you, if you find yourself curious about how our great-great-grandmothers spent their nights, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? A like on this video helps more people discover these forgotten stories, and I genuinely want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and your words fuel these late-night storytelling sessions. Now, dim your lights if you can. Let the world get a little softer. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. Get comfortable. We are about to spend the evening in 1850, and I promise you it will be unlike anything you've imagined. The first thing you need to understand about evenings before electricity is this. Fire was not just important. Fire was everything. When I say everything, I mean that the entire structure of a woman's evening, her schedule, her activities, her social life, even her relationships, revolved around the hearth. The fireplace or stove was not merely a source of warmth, it was the sun around which the domestic universe orbited. Let me paint you a picture. It is November in Massachusetts, 1852. A woman named Sarah, let us call her that, lives on a small farm with her husband and 3 children. The sun sets at 4:30 in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the world outside is pitch black. Inside, the house is cooling rapidly. Sarah knows that if she does not build the evening fire correctly, her family will spend the next 6 hours shivering. She also knows that if she builds it too enthusiastically, she will waste precious fuel that must last until spring. Here is what most people do not realize. Building a fire in the 1800s was not like turning on a gas stove or flicking a switch. It was an art form. Sarah starts with tinder, dry leaves, wood shavings, maybe some birch bark she collected last summer. Then comes the kindling, small sticks arranged in a specific pattern to allow airflow. Only then can she add larger logs. But she cannot just stack them randomly. The placement determines how long the fire burns, how much heat it produces, and whether smoke fills the room or goes up the chimney. This process takes about 30 minutes if everything goes perfectly. Often it does not. The wood might be damp, the chimney might have a blockage, the wind might be blowing from the wrong direction. I found a diary entry from a woman in Vermont who wrote in 1848, "Spent 2 hours trying to coax the wretched fire to life. My fingers were numb, my eyes streaming from smoke, and still the house remained cold as a tomb. Finally succeeded by 7 o'clock, only to realize I had no energy left to cook supper." Can you imagine? 2 hours just to get warm, and this was not a one-time disaster. This was a normal Tuesday. But here is where it gets interesting. Once that fire was burning, once the warmth started to spread through the room, everything changed. The hearth became magnetic. Family members would naturally drift toward it. Chairs were positioned in a semicircle around the fireplace. Light spilled from the flames, creating a warm orange glow that softened faces and cast dancing shadows on the walls. This was not just a heat source, this was the social centre of the home. Think about how we gather around televisions today. The couch faces the screen. We orient our entire living room around that glowing rectangle. In the 1800s, the fireplace served that exact purpose, except it was interactive. It required constant attention. Every 20 minutes or so, someone needed to add another log. Every hour, the ashes needed to be shifted. The fire was a living thing, and it kept people engaged, present, and together in a way that is hard for us to understand now. I want you to notice something remarkable here. In our modern world, we work so hard to automate everything. We want our homes to heat themselves, our lights to turn on with voice commands, our entertainment to require zero effort. But Sarah and women like her had no choice but to be constantly, actively involved in maintaining their environment. And you know what? There was something deeply satisfying about that. A historian named Ruth Schwartz Cowan studied household labour in the 19th century. She found something surprising in women's letters and diaries. Yes, they complained about the work, yes, they were exhausted, but they also expressed a sense of competence, of mastery, of pride. When Sarah successfully built a fire that burned steadily all evening, keeping her family warm and allowing her to cook dinner, she felt accomplished. She had created comfort from raw materials. She had controlled her environment through skill and knowledge. We have lost that, have we not? When was the last time you felt genuinely proud of keeping your home warm? You just set the thermostat and forget about it. There is convenience in that, absolutely, but there is also a loss, a disconnection from the basic acts of survival and care. Now let me tell you about the economics of fire, because this is where things get really interesting. In 1850, a typical household in New England would use somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds of coal per week during winter. If they burned wood instead, they needed even more. Estimates suggest a family could go through several cords of wood per season. A cord of wood, by the way, is a stack measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Picture that. Now picture needing multiple cords to survive one winter. This meant that men and boys spent enormous amounts of time in autumn chopping, splitting, and stacking wood. But who managed the daily consumption? Who decided how many logs to burn each evening? Who balanced warmth against scarcity? The women, and they became incredibly skilled at it. One woman in rural Ohio kept detailed records in 1863. She noted that on the coldest nights she could keep the main room comfortable with 4 large logs and 6 smaller pieces over a 5-hour evening. On milder nights, 2 logs and some kindling sufficed. She knew exactly which wood burned hottest, hickory and oak, and which burned longest. She knew that maple produced less smoke and was better when someone in the family had a cough. This was not casual knowledge. This was expertise developed over years of practice. And here is the fascinating part. This expertise had to be passed down. Mothers taught daughters. Older women taught younger neighbours. There were no YouTube tutorials, obviously, no instructional manuals. The knowledge lived in women's hands and memories. If you could not build a proper fire, you could not run a household. It was that simple. Let me share one more detail that really drives this home. Candles and lamp oil were expensive, really expensive. A pound of candles in 1850 cost about 10 cents, which does not sound like much until you realise that the average labourer earned about $1 per day. So a pound of candles represented 10% of a daily wage, and a single candle might burn for only 2 to 4 hours. This meant that most families used minimal lighting in the evenings. They relied heavily on firelight. Women positioned their chairs close to the hearth, not just for warmth, but for light. If you wanted to sew, read, write a letter, any activity that required seeing, you needed to be right by the fire. This created an interesting social dynamic. Everyone was physically close. You could not retreat to separate rooms the way we do now. You were together whether you liked it or not. And you know what I find beautiful about this? It forced conversation. It forced connection. Yes, sometimes people probably wanted space. Yes, families argued and tensions existed. But they could not just scroll on their phones to avoid each other. They could not put on headphones and disappear into a private world. They were present. They had to be. There is a letter I came across from a woman in Philadelphia, written in 1857. She described her evening routine. After supper, we gather by the fire. John reads the newspaper aloud while I mend stockings. The children play quietly with wooden blocks at our feet. Sometimes we do not speak for an hour, but the silence feels companionable, not lonely. The crackling fire and the occasional turn of a page are the only sounds. I find a peace in these evenings that the daylight hours with their rush and noise do not provide. That word, companionable silence, struck me. When was the last time you sat in companionable silence with someone? Not awkward silence, not silence because you're both on your phones, but genuine, comfortable, shared quiet. I think we have almost lost the ability to tolerate that kind of peace. The hearth also had seasonal rhythms that structured the entire year. In summer, the evening fire was minimal, just enough to cook supper, then quickly extinguished because of the heat. Women would take their handwork outside in the lingering twilight. But come autumn, as the days shortened and temperatures dropped, the fire reclaimed its central position. October meant it was time to check the chimney, repair any cracks in the hearthstones, and stock up on fuel. By November, the fire burned most of the day and all evening. This continued through March or April, depending on the climate. Imagine living so closely attuned to the seasons. We climate control our way through the year now, barely noticing the shifts. But women in the 1800s felt every change intimately. The return of the evening fire marked a transition not just in weather, but in lifestyle. Winter evenings meant more indoor time, more family time, more handwork and storytelling. There was actually something to look forward to in the darker months, a coziness and togetherness that summer's longer days and outdoor work did not provide. I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. I am describing this world with a certain warmth and nostalgia, and I need to be honest, it was also brutally hard. Women's hands were rough and often burned from managing fires. Eyes were irritated by smoke. Backs ached from bending over hearths. The labour was relentless, and there was no day off, no vacation from keeping the fire alive. I do not want to romanticize that struggle, but I also do not want us to miss what was valuable in that way of life. There was a rhythm, a purpose, a set of skills that mattered deeply, and there was an enforced presence with family, with the work of survival, with the natural world's cycles, that we have almost entirely lost. As electric light spread in the late 1800s and early 1900s, something profound shifted. Suddenly, you could read in any room, you could separate, you could extend the day artificially. Women's labour did not necessarily decrease, that is a whole other complicated story, but the social structure of the evening changed dramatically. The hearth stopped being the centre, and then came radio, then television, and here we are, each of us often in a separate room, staring at separate screens, living in our own isolated bubbles of entertainment. We gained so much, but we lost the fire. Here is what I want you to take from this. The next time you adjust your thermostat without thinking, or flick on a light switch, or settle in for an evening of streaming, pause for just a second. Feel a little gratitude for the women who spent their evenings battling smoke and cold to create the same comfort you now access with the button. And maybe, just maybe, consider what it would mean to create your own hearth. Not literally, of course, but metaphorically. What if you designated one evening a week to gather with the people in your home? No screens, just presence, just conversation, or comfortable sieste, or a shared activity. What if you tried to reclaim a tiny piece of what Sarah and millions of women like her experienced every single night? That sense of togetherness, of working together to create warmth and light. I think there is something we are hungry for in that. I think that is why cozy evenings, hygge, slow living, these concepts resonate so deeply right now. We are not just nostalgic for an imaginary past. We are recognizing something valuable that got lost in the rush toward convenience. The evening hearth was not just about fire. It was about presence. It was about ritual. It was about the daily act of creating home. And while we cannot and probably should not go back to that level of labor, we can think about what we want our evenings to feel like. We can choose to build our own kind of hearth, whatever form that takes. So as we close this first part of our journey, I want you to imagine Sarah one more time. It is nearly 9 o'clock. The fire has burned down to glowing coals. The children are asleep upstairs, bundled under quilts. Sarah banks the fire carefully, ensuring enough embers survive until morning, when she will coax it back to life. Her husband is already in bed. She takes a final moment by the dying light, perhaps touching the warm stones of the hearth, feeling the day's work in her tired muscles, and then she too retires. Tomorrow morning, well, a few hours from now really, she will start it all over again, and so will we, in our own way. But before Sarah goes to sleep, and before we move forward in our story, there is something else happening by that firelight. While the fire keeps the family warm, Sarah's hands are not idle. They are busy with needle and thread, creating something beautiful from scraps of fabric. And that needlework, those evening hours spent stitching, reveals an entirely different layer of women's evening lives, one that blended necessity with artistry, economy with expression, survival with beauty. What did those needles create? What did those evening hours of stitching mean? And why did a woman's skill with a needle determine not just her family's warmth, but her own value in society? That is where we are headed next, into a world where every stitch carried meaning and every evening brought the quiet rhythm of thread pulling through fabric. Stay with me. The story is just beginning to unfold. So there she sits, Sarah, our woman from 1850. The fire is crackling, her family has eaten dinner, the dishes are washed, and now, finally, she can sit down. But her hands do not rest. They never really rest. Instead, she reaches into her sewing basket, pulls out a piece of fabric with a hole in it, threads her needle by firelight and begins to darn. You might think this is just mending, just fixing things. But oh, it is so much more than that. Because in the world before television, before electric lights, before mass-produced clothing you could buy ready-made at a store, a woman's skill with the needle quite literally determined her worth. Not her character, not her intelligence, not her kindness, her needlework. The tiny stitches she could execute by dim firelight were being judged, assessed, and used to decide whether she was marriageable, respectable, accomplished, whether she was valuable. Does that make you uncomfortable? It should. Because we are about to enter a world where embroidery was not a hobby, it was a test. And every evening women sat in judgment, stitching their way towards social acceptance or rejection. Let me take you back further. Not to 1850 now, but to 1789. A 9-year-old girl named Mary Ann Body sits at a table, bent over a piece of fabric stretched tight in an embroidery frame. Her fingers are small, still growing, but they are already learning the alphabet in thread. She stitches each letter carefully, capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, row after row, until the sampler is covered in her work. This is not art class. This is not for fun. This is her education. This piece of fabric will be kept, possibly framed, and shown to future employers or suitors to prove that Mary Ann has been properly trained. that she possesses the patience, the precision, the feminine accomplishment required of a respectable woman. Now imagine being Mary Ann. You are 9 years old, your eyes hurt from squinting at the tiny stitches, your fingers are cramped. You would rather be outside, playing, exploring, reading a book, but no, you must stitch, because your future depends on it. Your sampler is your resume, your report card, your proof of worth all rolled into one. This was the reality for girls across social classes, though the details differed. Working class girls learned plain sewing, making and mending simple clothing, darning stockings until the original fabric was barely visible beneath layers of careful repairs. They learned this not as an accomplishment, but as survival. If you could not sew, you could not clothe your family. If you could not darn, you would go through stockings at a rate your budget could never sustain. But middle and upper class girls, they learned something else entirely. They learned what was called fancy work, embroidery, decorative stitching, the kind of needlework that served no practical purpose except to demonstrate refinement, patience, and marriageability. Let that sink in for a moment. They spent hours, no years, of their evenings learning a skill whose primary function was to prove they were suitable wives. Here is what the Victorian needlework hierarchy looked like, and yes, there was an actual hierarchy. At the very bottom was plain sewing, making clothes, mending tears, darning socks. This was considered suitable for servants and working-class women. Respectable, but not impressive. A step up from that was knitting. Knitting lived a double life. Servants knitted stockings by candlelight because they had to. But ladies of the house also knitted, not for utility, but to pass time during social occasions. Knitting could be done while chatting, while listening to someone read aloud, while sitting in a parlour with guests. Your hands stayed busy, proving you were not idle, but your mind was free to socialise. And at the very top of the pyramid, fancy needlework, embroidery on ecclesiastical linens, decorative cross-stitch, elaborate patterns worked in silk thread on fine fabric. This was the realm of accomplished ladies. This was what got you noticed. Charlotte Bronte understood this perfectly. In her novel Jane Eyre, she uses needlework to signal social status. The servant Hannah is seen knitting stockings by candlelight, plain work, utilitarian, low status. But Eliza Reid, from a wealthy family, spends her time creating elaborate embroidered decorations for church linens. Her needlework is fancy, regimented, full of moral rectitude, but empty of passion. Bronte is making a point here. The needlework you did revealed not just your social class, but your very character. So what did this look like in practice? What were women actually doing during those evening hours by the fireside? Let me give you some numbers, because the scale of this will surprise you. A typical middle-class woman in the mid-1800s might spend anywhere from 2 to 4 hours per evening on needlework. That is 14 to 28 hours per week. Over a year, 700 to 1400 hours spent stitching. By the time a woman reached age 40, she might have logged over 30,000 hours of needlework. 30,000 hours. Think about what you could master in that amount of time. A musical instrument, multiple languages, advanced mathematics. But instead, these hours went into creating decorative pillowcases, embroidered collars, crocheted doilies, knitted shawls, items whose primary purpose was to signal that the woman had time, skill, and proper feminine training. And the judgment never stopped. When you visited someone's home, you noticed their needlework. You commented on it. You compared it to your own or to other women's work. An 1873 issue of Harper's Bazaar talked about women who had turned their fancy needlework skills into profit. One widow, the magazine reported, paid off the mortgage on her city house and supported herself and her child for many years almost entirely with her swift crochet needle. That is remarkable. That is a woman using the one marketable skill she'd been taught to survive. But here is the darker side. For every woman who successfully monetized her needlework, there were dozens who worked in what was called the sweated labor system. Professional seamstresses, women who sewed for a living, faced conditions we can barely imagine. Let me tell you about a woman named Mrs. Lavinia Casey. In the 1880s, she made shirts. She was paid 7 pence per dozen. She worked from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. 16 hours. In that time, after caring for her children, she managed about 12 hours of actual sewing. She typically completed 2 dozen shirts per day. Her total wage, 1 shilling and 2 pence. From that, she had to pay 2 shillings and 6 pence per week to rent her Singer sewing machine, plus another shilling for oil and thread. Do the math. She barely broke even, and she worked 16-hour days. This was not unusual. This was normal for working-class seamstresses. The sewing machine, which we think of as a labour-saving device, actually made their lives worse. It allowed factory owners to demand more production in less time. The machine became, as one historian put it, a new taskmaster, a slave driver, an instrument of degradation. So when we talk about women's evening needlework, we have to hold 2 realities in our heads at once. For some women, middle and upper class women sitting in comfortable parlours, needlework was a leisure activity, an accomplishment, a way to pass evening hours while chatting with family. But for other women, needlework was brutal labour, poorly paid, physically exhausting and inescapable. The same skill, vastly different meanings. Can you see why I wanted to tell you this story? Because we romanticise the past. We see images of Victorian women doing embroidery and think how peaceful, how meditative, how lovely. And for some it was, but for many it was survival. It was judgment. It was the narrow path they had to walk to be considered worthy of marriage, employment, or social respect. Now let me pull you back to Sarah for a moment, because I want to show you what this looked like in one woman's evening. Sarah sits by the fire. Her mending basket is full. There are stockings with holes. Her husband's work socks have worn through at the heel again. There is her son's shirt with a torn seam. There is a nightgown for her daughter that needs to be let down as the girl grows. And there is a pillowcase she's been embroidering for months, slowly adding a decorative border whenever she has time. She starts with the stockings. Darning is precise work. You cannot just sew over the hole. You have to create a woven patch that matches the original fabric structure. First, she runs parallel threads across the hole in one direction. Then she weaves the needle over and under those threads in the perpendicular direction, creating a grid that fills the gap. Done well, a darn is nearly invisible and as strong as the original fabric. Done poorly, it creates a lumpy, uncomfortable spot that will wear through even faster. Sarah learned to darn from her mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from hers. The knowledge passed down through generations, mother to daughter, evening after evening, firelight after firelight. And young girls practiced on darning samplers, pieces of fabric where they deliberately created holes, then practiced filling them with different weaving patterns. Some of these samplers still exist in museums. Beautiful, colourful geometric patterns, created solely to teach the skill of invisible repair. But here is what gets me. Sarah does this work by firelight. Maybe she has a single candle if the family can afford to burn one. Her eyes strain. Her back aches from bending forward. Her fingers, after hours of stitching, develop calluses. By the time she is 50, her eyesight might be permanently damaged from years of close work in dim light. This was not uncommon. Women frequently lost their near vision, developed chronic eye strain, or suffered from headaches, all from evening needlework. And yet they kept stitching, because what choice did they have? Clothing was expensive. A single ready-made shirt might cost a week's wages for a working-class family. So you mended. You darned, you patched, you turned collars when they frayed, cutting them off and reattaching them upside down to get more wear. You unpicked worn-out garments and used the good fabric to make children's clothes. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap had value. This brings us to something fascinating. The distinction between plain work and fancy work was not just about skill level. It was about time. Plain work was necessary. You had to do it to maintain your family's clothing, but fancy work, that was optional. That was a luxury. If you had time in your evening for decorative embroidery, it meant you were not desperately behind on mending. It meant you had help, servants who did the plain work while you focused on the fancy. Or it meant you had deliberately carved out time, perhaps sacrificing sleep to create something beautiful. I found a quote from Isabella Beeton's 1861 book of household management that captures this perfectly. She wrote, "Light or fancy needlework often forms a portion of the evening's recreation for the ladies of the household. Recreation, not labour. For wealthy women, embroidery was recreation. For their ladies' maids, plain sewing was employment. The same activity, completely different meanings. And here is where it gets really interesting. Some women rebelled against this system through their needlework. They used their stitches to make political statements. The suffrage movement in the early 1900s created elaborate embroidered banners. These banners featured the names of female scientists, authors, academics, suffrage leaders. They included slogans like "Justice for All" and "Votes for Women." Think about the brilliance of this. These women took a traditionally feminine craft, embroidery, and weaponized it. They took the skill they had been forced to learn as proof of their domestic suitability and used it to demand political power. The Artists' Suffrage League understood that embroidery could move from the private domestic sphere into the public political sphere. And it did. So when Sarah sits by her fire darning stockings, and occasionally working on her decorative pillowcase, she is participating in a tradition that is simultaneously beautiful and oppressive, creative and constraining, empowering and limiting. Her needles are tools of survival, markers of status, evidence of skill, and potentially, though she might not know it yet, instruments of resistance. Now I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine if we had taken all those hours, those 30,000 hours that women spent on needlework over a lifetime, and given them different tools. What if instead of needles and thread we'd given them pens and paper? What if we had said, use these evening hours to write, to study, to experiment, to create in ways that build knowledge rather than just demonstrate accomplishment? What might women have achieved? We will never know, but we can honour what they did achieve within the constraints they faced. Because let me be clear, I am not dismissing needlework as worthless. The skills involved are real. The artistry is genuine. The objects created, quilts that kept families warm, samplers that preserved family history, embroidered pieces that brought beauty into harsh lives, these mattered. They still matter. What I am saying is that women deserve choice. They deserve to decide whether to spend their evenings sewing or reading, or writing, or doing mathematics, or staring into the fire and thinking deep thoughts without their hands needing to be busy. They deserve to have their worth measured by something other than the evenness of their stitches. And yet, despite all of this, despite the judgment, the eye strain, the endless hours, many women found genuine joy in their needlework. The rhythm of stitching can be meditative. The act of creating something with your hands is satisfying in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never experienced it. There is a reason why knitting, embroidery, and cross-stitch are experiencing a resurgence today. People are rediscovering the pleasure of handwork in our hyper-digital age. But here is the difference. Today, when you pick up a needle, you choose it. It is not mandatory. It is not being judged. Your marriage prospects do not depend on it. And that freedom, that ability to sew for pleasure rather than obligation, that is the gift the past could not give these women. As Sarah finishes darning the last stocking, she folds her work and places it back in the basket. Tomorrow night there will be more mending. There is always more mending. But tomorrow night might also bring something different. Tomorrow night, she might gather with other women. She might attend what they call a quilting bee. And those gatherings, those were magic. Because when women came together around needlework, something transformed. The work became secondary, the connection became primary. And in those circles of women bent over fabric, stitching and talking and laughing, an entirely different kind of evening emerged. One we need to explore because it reveals how women turned solitary labour into social revolution. But that story deserves its own space, its own time. So stay with me, keep the lights low, let the fire in your mind burn a little brighter. Because we are about to enter the most social, the most subversive, the most powerful expression of women's evening culture before television. The quilting bee, and trust me, it is not what you think. Picture this, it is a Wednesday morning in November 1862. In a farmhouse in rural Iowa, a woman named Martha wakes before dawn. But today is different. Today is not just another day of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and endless chores. Today is the quilting bee, and that changes everything. Martha hurries through her morning work. She bakes extra bread. She prepares a large pot of stew that can simmer all day without much attention. She sweeps the main room and sets up the quilting frame. 4 long pieces of wood that create a rectangle large enough to hold an entire quilt. By 9 in the morning, women start arriving. They come on foot, on horseback, in wagons. Some have travelled 5 miles. One woman has brought her infant, bundled against the cold. Another brings her elderly mother, who can no longer sew but loves the company. And here is what you need to understand. This is not just a sewing circle. This is the original social network. This is Facebook, Instagram, and group chat all rolled into one. This is where information flows, where alliances form, where women support each other through the hardest parts of their lives. This is where isolated farm wives who might not see another woman for weeks suddenly find themselves part of a community, and it happens around a quilt. Now, you might be wondering, why quilts? Why did quilting bees become so central to women's evening culture? And the answer is actually quite practical. Making a quilt top, piecing together all those small fabric squares into a pattern, that was something you could do alone, slowly over months. You could work on it in spare moments. But quilting the actual quilt, that is when you attach the decorative top layer to the batting and backing layer with thousands of tiny stitches. And that work goes so much faster with multiple hands. What might take one woman weeks to complete, 8 women could finish in a single day. So quilting bees were efficient. But efficiency was never the real point. The real point was this: women needed each other. And quilting bees gave them permission to gather, to talk, to exist in community in a world that otherwise kept them isolated on separate farms and in separate households. The golden age of quilting bees was roughly 1840 to 1875. This was the era of westward expansion, a massive immigration, the Civil War, and incredible social upheaval. And right in the middle of all that chaos, women were gathering around quilting frames, creating beauty and building networks that would sustain them through unimaginable hardship. Let me tell you about one specific quilt that captures this perfectly. Have you ever heard of the Jane Stickle quilt? Jane was a woman living in Vermont during the Civil War. Between 1851 and 1854, she created a quilt that contained 5,602 individual pieces of fabric. 5,602 pieces, each one cut, arranged, and sewn into intricate patterns. The quilt measures roughly 80 inches square and contains 169 different block patterns, plus a complex border. It is a masterpiece. But here is what makes it extraordinary. Jane did not do this alone. According to records and local history, Jane frequently sewed with friends at her home. She was part of a quilting community. Those 5,602 pieces represent not just Jane's skill, but also hours of conversation, shared laughter, exchanged recipes, whispered confidences, and mutual support. The quilt is beautiful, but the relationships that formed around it, those were priceless. Now you are probably imagining a peaceful scene, women sitting quietly stitching, maybe humming hymns, and sometimes it was like that. But often, it was loud, it was gossipy, it was full of debate and laughter and occasionally tears. Because when you put 8 women in a room for 6 to 8 hours with their hands busy but their minds free, everything comes out, everything. One woman who kept a diary in 1860 wrote about a quilting bee where the conversation ranged from recipes for preserving peaches to concerns about a neighbour's sick child to passionate arguments about slavery and abolition. Yes, abolition. Political discussions happened at quilting bees. In fact, quilting bees became one of the primary venues where women discussed politics, precisely because they were women-only spaces where men did not control the conversation. And here is something that will blow your mind. Susan B. Anthony, the famous suffragist, made her first speeches about political rights at quilting bees when she was a teenager. Quilting bees, not formal political gatherings, not men's debating societies, quilting bees. By the early 1900s, women's rights had become such a frequent topic at quilting bees that they were essentially functioning as organising spaces for the suffrage movement. Let me paint the full picture of what a typical quilting bee looked like. The women arrive around 9 in the morning. The hostess has already stretched the quilt layers onto the frame. The decorative top that has been pieced together over months, a layer of cotton batting for warmth, and a plain backing fabric. The 3 layers are basted together loosely, then attached to the frame. Now comes the quilting itself. The women arrange themselves around the frame. Typically, 7 or 8 can fit comfortably, though some larger frames accommodated 10 or 12. Each woman has a needle, thread, and a thimble, and they begin stitching. The goal is to create small, even stitches that go through all 3 layers, creating patterns that add both structure and beauty. Some quilts have simple straight-line quilting. Others feature elaborate designs, feathers, flowers, geometric patterns that require significant skill. As they stitch, they talk, and this is where the magic happens. Because in a world where women's literacy rates were lower than men's, where newspapers were expensive and often unavailable, where travel was difficult and communication slow, quilting bees functioned as news networks. A woman who had visited town last week shares what she learned at the general store. Another woman passes along a letter she received from relatives back east. Someone mentions that a particular merchant has raised his prices, or that a new family has moved into the area. Information flows. But it was not just news, it was support. Practical, immediate, life-saving support. If a woman was struggling to feed her family, other women would know, and they would quietly arrange to leave extra food, or to take her children for a day so she could rest, or to help with a particularly overwhelming task. If a woman was being abused by her husband, the other women knew. They might not have had the legal power to intervene, but they could offer refuge, advice, or at least the knowledge that she was not alone. One pioneering woman who settled in Texas in the 1830s later recalled quilting bees where women might try to outrival each other in the daintiness of their stitches, but they also helped each other in every way. She said, and I love this quote, "They helped each other." Perhaps this justifies the whole of a pioneer woman's suffering. Perhaps this justifies the whole of a pioneer woman's suffering. Think about that. The community formed at quilting bees was so valuable, so essential, that it justified the incredible hardship of frontier life. And quilting bees had rituals. Oh, the rituals. If a quilting bee was gathered to create a wedding quilt for a young bride, the finished quilt would be placed on the floor when it was done. Then a cat would be put in the middle of the quilt, and all the unmarried young people would sit around the edges. Whoever's head the cat jumped over was said to be the next person to marry. Can you imagine? This is predating algorithms, folks. This is feline-powered matchmaking. Or consider the freedom quilt. When a man celebrated his 21st birthday in New England, quilters often presented him with a specially made quilt. This was called a freedom quilt because it symbolized his freedom to leave home and establish his own household. It was a practical gift. He would need bedding, but also a symbolic one. The quilt represented the community's blessing on his transition to adulthood. And then there were memory quilts made from the clothing of deceased loved ones. Imagine losing your husband in the Civil War. His body never returned. You have nothing but his clothes. So you cut up his shirts, his trousers, and you piece them into a quilt. Now every night you sleep under a blanket made from his fabric. The quilt becomes a memorial, a source of comfort, a tangible connection to someone you have lost. Women at Quilting Bees helped each other make these memory quilts. They shared the grief, they shared the work, and they created something beautiful from profound loss. But here is where Quilting Bees get really interesting. They were not just passive social gatherings, they were sites of resistance. During the abolitionist movement, women in the North created quilts specifically to raise money for the cause. They held quilting bees where they would make multiple quilts, then sell or raffle them at fairs. The proceeds went to support escaped slaves or to fund anti-slavery publications. An observer in 1847 wrote about sewing circles where one of the members would read an anti-slavery book or paper to the others during the meeting. These women could not vote, they could not hold political office, but they could sew, and they turned their needles into weapons of social change. During the Civil War itself, Quilting Bees ramped up production to an almost unimaginable degree. Women in both the North and the South organized to make quilts for soldiers. The United States Sanitary Commission, which coordinated relief efforts for Union troops, called for quilts, and women responded. Over 300,000 quilts were created. 300,000. That means 1 out of every 6 Union soldiers was kept warm by a hand-sewn quilt made by women at Quilting Bees. 1 out of 6. And these were not simple quilts. Women put their hearts into them. They embroidered messages of hope and encouragement. They included their names and locations, hoping that a soldier far from home might feel less alone knowing that a specific woman in a specific town had made this quilt for him. Some quilts had pockets sewn into them where small items could be tucked, a handkerchief, a religious text, a small photograph. Women were trying to send comfort across impossible distances. After the war, Quilting Bees continued to serve political purposes. The temperance movement, women fighting against alcohol abuse, organized Quilting Bees to create fundraising quilts. They incorporated the Women's Christian Temperance Union colors into their designs, blue for water, white for purity. They held bees where they discussed strategies for combating alcoholism, which was devastating families across the country. These women could not pass laws, but they could organize, they could fundraise, they could create public pressure, and it often started at a quilting bee. Now, I want to tell you about the social aspect more intimately, because quilting bees were not all serious politics and heavy grief. They were also pure fun. The hostess would prepare a large midday meal. This was not optional, this was required. You fed the women who came to help you, and the food was often the highlight. Meat pies, fruit preserves, fresh bread, cakes, cookies. For women whose daily meals were often simple and repetitive, a quilting bee dinner was a feast. And in the evening, the evening, because quilting bees did not end when the sun went down. Remember, this was before electric lights, so work might pause when it became too dark to see fine stitches. But that did not mean everyone went home. Instead, the men were invited to arrive. Husbands, sweethearts, brothers, fathers. They came in their Sunday best, because a quilting bee evening was a social event. There would be food again, supper, and then music, dancing, singing, courtship. Young people used quilting bee evenings to meet potential partners. It was one of the few socially acceptable venues where young, unmarried people could interact without constant adult supervision. There is even a song about this. It is called Aunt Dinah's Quilting Party, and it tells the story of a couple who stroll home together after such an evening. The song was popular in the mid-1800s and captures the romantic, festive atmosphere of these gatherings. But, and this is important, not all quilting bees were open to everyone. Just as there was a hierarchy in needlework skills, there was a hierarchy in quilting bees. Some bees were exclusive. If a woman had created a truly special quilt top, something intricate and beautiful, she wanted it quilted by women with exceptional skill. Because here is the thing, anyone can learn to piece a quilt top, but quilting itself, creating those tiny, even stitches, that takes years of practice, and a poorly quilted top could ruin months of work. So skilled quilters were in demand. Being invited to an exclusive bee was a mark of social prestige. It meant your stitching was good enough that other women trusted you with their finest work. This created a weird dynamic where quilting bees were simultaneously egalitarian. Anyone could participate in a basic bee, and hierarchical, the best quilters formed an elite group. In isolated regions, though, these hierarchies mattered less. A woman in the southwest reminisced, "One day a week when the neighbours came to quilt, my brother would take the bed in Mamma's room down to the kitchen and put up the frame for that day. It was quite a job, but he never minded. There were no more than 4 women working because there was no room for more. 4 women in a kitchen, with a bed frame being moved every week just to make space for quilting. That is how much it mattered. That is how essential these gatherings were. And here is something modern viewers of historical dramas often miss. Quilting bees were loud, they were messy. There were children running underfoot. Babies were nursed during the quilting. Older children might be assigned to watch younger ones outside or in another room. But inevitably someone would cry or fall or need attention. Dogs wandered in and out. The fire needed tending. Someone had to stir the stew. Life did not stop for quilting bees. The quilting happened in the midst of life, but that was part of the beauty. Women were not performing some idealized version of femininity. They were themselves. They could be tired, grumpy, frustrated, joyful, silly, serious, all of it. And it was accepted, because everyone there understood. Everyone there was living the same exhausting, demanding, occasionally rewarding life. Now, you might be wondering what happened to quilting bees. Why did they decline? The answer is complex. The sewing machine, which became widely available in the 1880s and 1890s, sped up the process of piecing quilt tops, so women needed less help with that part. The quilting itself still required hand stitching, but as more women gained access to sewing machines, they could complete projects faster on their own. Then came the telephone. Suddenly, you did not need to wait for a quilting bee to get news or talk to a friend. You could pick up the phone. The automobile made travel easier, so women had more options for socializing beyond their immediate neighbors. And slowly, gradually, the necessity of quilting bees faded. By the 1930s and 40s, quilting bees were becoming rare. They were seen as old-fashioned, a quaint relic of pioneer days. Some women's groups still held them, but they were no longer the central social institution they had once been. And with their decline, something valuable was lost. Not just the quilts, though many beautiful quilts stopped being made, but the community. The face-to-face, sustained, intimate community that formed when women worked together for hours at a time, day after day, year after year. Here is what I find most powerful about quilting bees. They took something that could have been isolating, women confined to domestic labour scattered across rural landscapes, and transformed it into connection. They took a necessity, creating warm bedding, and made it beautiful. They took silence and made it conversation. They took powerlessness and made it organizing. Quilting bees were not perfect. They could be exclusive, judgmental, petty. Small-town social dynamics can be cruel as well as supportive. But at their best, quilting bees represented something we have almost lost: the ability to work with your hands while engaging your mind, the experience of creating something useful and beautiful in collaboration with others, the deep knowledge that comes from sustained in-person community. And you know what is remarkable? Quilting bees are making a comeback in the 21st century, women and men, because quilting is no longer gender restricted, are forming quilting groups. They meet weekly or monthly, they bring projects, they stitch together, and yes, they talk. They share their lives, they support each other. Turns out that the need for community, for meaningful work, for connection, that need has not disappeared just because we have phones and internet and television. But the quilting bees of today exist in a different context. They are optional. They are leisure. They are not the only social outlet available. And that makes them both less necessary and more precious. When you choose to attend a quilting circle today, you are choosing to put down your phone, step away from your screen, and do something with your hands while connecting with other humans. That choice echoes back through history to Martha in Iowa, Jane in Vermont, and countless unnamed women who found community around a quilting frame. As the evening winds down at Martha's quilting bee, the women admire their work. The quilt is nearly finished. Tomorrow, Martha will complete the binding herself, the final step of folding fabric over the edges and stitching it down. But the quilting is done. And more importantly, the connection has been renewed. These women will return to their separate farms, their separate lives. But they go back knowing they are not alone. They go back with news, with recipes, with advice, with laughter still echoing in their ears. They go back changed. And as Martha watches them leave, as she tidies her house and prepares for bed, she might not realize that this quilting bee, this one ordinary Wednesday in 1862, is part of a tradition that will be studied, celebrated and revived over a century later. She might not know that historians will examine her quilts, that her patterns will be preserved, that her story matters. She just knows that today was good. Today she was not alone. But Martha's day is not quite finished yet. Because once the house is quiet, once the children are asleep and the evening chores complete, Martha will sit by the fire one more time, and she will reach for something different. Not a needle this time, but a pen. Because there is another evening ritual we have not yet explored, one that was just as important as sewing, just as revealing, just as rich with meaning. Martha is going to write a letter. And the art of evening correspondence, the careful selection of paper, the choice of words, the etiquette, the emotion, that is a world unto itself. One we absolutely must enter, because letters were not just communication. They were lifelines. They were power. They were, in some ways, the most intimate thing women created by firelight. So let the quilting frame fold away, let the needles rest. Now we pick up the pen. And what we discover there might just surprise you. The fire has burned low, the children are asleep, the house is finally blessedly quiet, and Martha sits at her small wooden table with a single candle burning, a sheet of cream-coloured paper before her, and a pen in her hand. She pauses, takes a breath, and begins to write. You see, this moment right here, this is where women held power in ways that might shock you. Because a letter was not just a letter. A letter was a weapon. A letter was a promise. A letter was a test. And the way you wrote it, the paper you chose, even the colour of your ink, all of it was being judged. All of it mattered. In a world where women could not vote, could not own property in many places, could not speak in public forums, they could write letters, and through those letters, they shaped politics, controlled courtships, maintained empires of social connection, and occasionally, just occasionally, changed history. But here is what makes this fascinating. Letter writing had rules. So many rules, and women who broke those rules paid for it with damaged reputations, lost marriage prospects, and social exile. So let me take you inside the Victorian letter-writing world, because it was elaborate, bizarre, and absolutely ruthless in its demands. First, the paper. You could not just grab any paper. The quality, colour, and size of your stationery announced your social class before you even wrote a word. An 1891 etiquette book was very clear on this. Nothing looks more mean and untidy than thin sheets and envelopes of the same quality, through which the writing exhibits itself. Translation: cheap paper marks you as cheap. Upper-class women use thick, high-quality paper. The texture mattered. The weight mattered. Fashion dictated whether paper should be small or large, square or oblong. But one thing never changed. It had to be expensive. And the colour? For most correspondents, white or cream. But women had slightly more freedom here than men. Light shades of blue or lavender were sometimes acceptable for ladies. A light spritz of perfume on the paper? That was a matter of debate. Some etiquette guides said it was charming. Others called it vulgar. You had to know your audience. Get it wrong and you were judged. Now the ink. An 1889 handbook stated, "The colour of ink most durable and tasteful on all occasions and for all correspondence is black. Red ink should never be used for the body of a letter. Blue ink may be, fancy ink may answer for ladies, but is not in taste for gentlemen." So women had a tiny bit more creative freedom. They could use coloured inks occasionally, but even then restraint was advised. Too much creativity signalled poor breeding. Then came the wax seal. Before envelopes became standard, letters were folded and sealed with wax, and the colour of that wax was a language all its own. Black wax meant mourning, always. If you received a letter sealed with black wax, you knew immediately that the sender had experienced a death. Red wax was for men, particularly for business correspondence. Women could use a variety of colours, blue, green, gold, depending on the occasion and the recipient, but you had to know the code. Use the wrong colour and you sent an unintended message. Are you starting to see how complicated this was? We are not even at the actual writing yet. We are still just setting up to write. And already there are a dozen ways to make a mistake that could haunt you socially. Now her handwriting. Oh, the handwriting. An 1893 guide instructed, "The handwriting should be clear and yet not too large and bold. It should possess some character and style, but not be adorned or ornamented with fine flourishes and dashes. So your penmanship had to be legible but not showy, distinctive but not ostentatious, feminine but not weak." How do you achieve all of that? Through practice. Hours and hours of practice. Girls spent their evening time copying letters, practicing their hand, developing a writing style that would be judged acceptable. And here is something that will make you appreciate your keyboard. Writing by candlelight or firelight was hard. Your eyes strained. The flickering light created shadows that made it difficult to see what you were writing. Ink could smudge if your hand moved wrong. And if you made a mistake, you could not just backspace. You had to either cross it out, which looked terrible, or start over entirely. So women learned to compose in their heads before putting pen to paper. They thought through sentences, planned their letters mentally, so they could write cleanly the first time. But the real power of letter writing was not in the mechanics. It was in what letters could do. Let me show you. Courtship letters. When a man wanted to court a woman in the Regency and Victorian eras, he had to formally request permission to correspond with her. To that. He had to ask if he could write to her, and she could say no. This was one of the most important tools at a young lady's disposal during courtship, the power of refusal. She could refuse to enter into correspondence which effectively ended the courtship before it began. Because correspondence was serious, it signalled that a couple was moving toward engagement. A historian named Dr. Sally Holloway from Oxford Brookes University explains it like this. Accepting signalled a couple was on the road to engagement. So when a woman said yes to correspondence, she was saying yes to a courtship, and that decision carried enormous weight. Now here is where it gets really interesting. What were these courtship letters like? Dr. Holloway found something surprising when she studied actual letters from the 1800s. She says, women's letters are marked by their modesty, their reserve. In contrast, men's letters ruminated at enormous length about the nature of love, the depth of their feeling, and many included poems. Men wrote these long, emotional, flowery letters, pages and pages about their feelings. Women were expected to be modest, reserved, careful. They could not appear too eager. They could not express too much emotion. They had to walk this incredibly narrow line between showing enough interest to encourage the man, but not so much interest that they appeared desperate or improper. And these letters were not private in the way we think of private. Families often shared courtship letters. A young woman might show her sister or mother a letter she received. A young man might read his letter aloud to his father or brother. So women wrote knowing that their words might be read by multiple people. They had to be careful. Every sentence was calculated. But letters could also be perfumed. Physically perfumed. You would smell it. You might press your lips to it. It was something that had touched the writer's hands and then touched your hands. Dr. Holloway describes this beautifully. The letter was not just information. It was a physical object infused with presence. Women would sometimes include a pressed flower, a lock of hair, a small drawing. These letters were sensory experiences, and the letters themselves were valuable as objects. If a courtship ended badly, letters became evidence. They could be used to prove that a man had made promises, or, more dangerously, they could be used to damage a woman's reputation. So women were often advised to burn correspondence after reading it, precisely because letters could be weaponized. Let me tell you about a woman who understood the power of letters better than almost anyone. Jane Austen. Yes, that Jane Austen. She was a prolific letter writer. We have surviving letters where she writes to her young niece, an 8-year-old child, and she writes the entire letter backwards, every word spelled in reverse. The letter starts, Jem raid Isak. My dear Isak, backwards, she continues, I hussiu uoya yippa wen rae. I wish you a happy new year. And she signs it, Roy etanoit chefat nua enaj netswa, your affectionate Aunt Jane Austen. This is linguistic playfulness. This is creativity. This is Jane Austen using letters as a form of entertainment and connection. But it also shows something important. Letter writing could be joyful. It could be fun. It could be a space where women played with language, experimented with voice, and expressed personality in ways they might not be able to do in public conversation. But letters were not just for courtship or family connection. Letters were political. Women used them to organize. During the abolitionist movement, women created vast letter-writing networks. They wrote to each other, sharing information, coordinating fundraising efforts, planning strategies. These letters circulated privately, woman to woman, creating a shadow network of political organizing that men often did not even realize existed. And during the suffrage movement, letter writing became even more important. Women wrote to legislators, they wrote to newspapers, they wrote to each other, maintaining morale and coordination across vast distances. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton maintained an extensive correspondence for decades. Their letters were not just friendly chatter. They were strategy sessions. They planned campaigns, drafted arguments, coordinated actions, all through letters. Here is a detail that will astound you. Anne Hampton Brewster was a 19th century American writer who lived in Rome. She wrote public letters, articles, really, for the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin and the Boston Daily Advertiser. These were professional, polished pieces about art, culture, and society in Rome. But she also received private letters from friends and family, and researchers who have studied her diaries found something remarkable. The emotional tone of her public letters versus what she revealed in her diaries and private correspondence was completely different. In public, she was restrained, professional, neutral. In private, she poured out her feelings, her frustrations, her deepest emotions. This reveals something crucial. Women were performing different selves in different contexts, and then letters were where they could be most authentic, but only in private correspondence. Public letters required a mask. Private letters could reveal truth, and women had to navigate between these modes constantly, always aware that a letter might end up being read by unintended eyes. Now, I want to talk about the physical act of evening letter writing. Because this was not casual, this was ritual. After all the evening chores were done, after the children were in bed, after the kitchen was cleaned and the next day's bread dough was set to rise, a woman would sit down at a table or desk, if she had one. Many women wrote at kitchen tables or on their laps. She would light a candle because lamp oil was expensive and candles were cheaper. She would take out her writing paper, stored carefully in a desk drawer or box to keep it clean and dry. Then she would prepare her pen. If she was using a quill pen, which was common until steel pens became widely available in the mid-1800s, she would need to trim it first. Sharpening a quill pen was a skill that required practice. Cut the angle wrong and the pen would not write smoothly. The ink had to be the right consistency. Not too thick or it would blob, not too thin or it would run. Many women mixed their own ink. They bought ink powder and combined it with water to the proper thickness. And then, finally, she could write. But even the act of writing required physical endurance. Dipping the pen in ink every few words, being careful not to smudge, forming letters carefully in the dim light. It was slow work. A letter that you could type in 5 minutes today might take 30 minutes or more to write by hand in candlelight. But women wrote anyway. They wrote to sisters who had moved west. They wrote to children who had married and left home. They wrote to friends they might not see for months or years. They wrote to mothers, to aunts, to women in their sewing circles. And through these letters, they maintained connections across impossible distances. One woman wrote in her diary in the 1850s about the joy she felt when she received a letter from her sister who had moved to California during the gold rush. She had not seen her sister in 3 years, might never see her again. But the letter, this piece of paper that had travelled thousands of miles, had been carried by ship and stagecoach and horseback. This letter brought her sister's voice into her home. She read it aloud to her family. She read it multiple times to herself. She kept it in a box with other treasured correspondence. And this is what letters did. They collapsed distance. They preserved voice. They created presence where there was absence. In a world without telephones, without instant messaging, without video calls, letters were how you stayed connected to people you loved. But here is something we might not think about. Letters also created pressure. If you received a letter, you were expected to respond within a reasonable time, usually within a week or two. Failing to respond was a social offence. It suggested you did not value the relationship. So women felt obligated to write even when they were exhausted, even when they had nothing particularly interesting to say. Letter writing was a social duty as much as a pleasure. And there were rules about what you could write. An 1870 guide warned, letter writing guides advised writing with absolute feeling and being cautious about saying too much. They also warned against saying the wrong things, regardless of whether these wrong things had real feelings behind them. So you had to be honest but not too honest, emotional but not too emotional, interesting but not improper. Every letter was a tightrope walk. Women also used letters to maintain their position in society. If you were invited to a party, you wrote a thank you letter. If someone experienced a death, you wrote a condolence letter. If someone was ill, you wrote a get well letter. These were not optional. They were required, and the quality of your letter was judged. A well-written condolence letter that struck the right tone of sympathy without being maudlin, that was a mark of good breeding. A poorly written one, that could damage your social standing. Let me share a condolence letter template that appeared in an 1870 letter writing guide. The tone is revealing. My dear Julia, you must have been prepared for some time past, from the gloomy tenor of my last few letters, for the mournful intelligence I have now to communicate. Our poor suffering friend has been called away to her final rest. The letter goes on in this vein, formal, restrained, religious. This was the expected tone. You could not be too raw in your grief, you had to package it appropriately. But some women chafed against these restrictions. Emily Dickinson, the poet, had a correspondence style that worried her brother. She was too creative, too playful, too unconventional in her letters, and in response to his criticism, she wrote back with dripping irony, I will be a little ninny, a little pussy-catty, a little Red Riding Hood. I will wear a bee in my bonnet and a rosebud in my hair. And what remains to do you shall be told hereafter. She was mocking the expectation that women's letters should be trivial and decorative. But even her mockery shows how much pressure existed to conform. Now, here is the beautiful part. Despite all the rules, despite all the judgment, letters gave women a space to develop their voice. When you write regularly, you develop style. You learn rhythm, you discover what works. Many women who became writers, novelists, journalists, essayists, developed their craft through letter writing. It was their training ground, and letters created history. We know so much about women's lives in the 18 and 1900s because they wrote letters. Diaries are wonderful, but letters are even better because they show both sides of a conversation. They reveal relationships in real time. Historians studying women's lives depend heavily on letters because they are one of the few sources where women's voices come through directly, unfiltered by male historians or editors. The decline of letter writing began with the telephone. When you could call someone and hear their voice immediately, the urgency of letter writing decreased. Then came email, texting, instant messaging. And now, most of us go months or years without writing an actual letter by hand. We have gained immediacy. We have gained convenience. But what have we lost? We have lost the ritual. The sitting down with intention to communicate, the physical act of forming words with a pen, the care required to craft sentences knowing you cannot easily change them. We have lost the anticipation of waiting for a response, the excitement of seeing a letter in the mail addressed to you in handwriting you recognize, the ability to hold something physical that someone you love created specifically for you. And we have lost the record. Text messages are ephemeral, emails pile up and get deleted, but letters in a box in an attic, those last. Those become history. Those tell future generations who we were and what we cared about. Martha finishes her letter. She blots the ink carefully. She folds the paper and seals it. In the morning, her husband will take it to town when he goes to sell grain, and he will leave it at the post office. It will travel for days, maybe weeks, before it reaches her sister back east. But it will reach her, and her sister will open it and hear Martha's voice across the distance, and that connection, fragile, slow but real, that is what sustained women through their isolated lives. As Martha sets down her pen and blows out the candle, she does not know that we will still be talking about letters like hers more than a century later. She does not know that historians will study 19th century women's correspondence to understand how women thought, felt, and navigated their constrained worlds. She just knows that tonight she has spoken to someone she loves. And in the morning her voice will begin its journey. But the evening is not quite over. Because even as Martha climbs the stairs to bed, in homes across America and Europe other women are still awake. And they are not writing letters or quilting or mending, they are reading aloud. They are gathered with their families around the fire, and one person holds a book, maybe a novel, maybe a newspaper, maybe a collection of poetry, and that voice fills the room. And what happens in those moments of shared reading? The stories that get told, the worlds that open up, the way reading aloud shapes family bonds and passes down culture, that is another kind of magic entirely, one that deserves our full attention. So let us turn the page together and see what women and their families discovered in the pages of books, read by firelight in those precious evening hours. There is a knock at the door. It is 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in 1865, and the Thompson family is expecting guests, not for dinner, dinner was hours ago, not for games, though those might come later. No, tonight is reading night, and the neighbours have been waiting all week to find out what happens next in the story. Because here is something that might shock you. Before Netflix had us hooked on cliffhangers and binge-watching, before television kept families glued to screens, there was reading aloud. And it was not some quaint, quiet activity. It was the entertainment. It was addictive. It was emotional. And it created shared cultural moments that brought entire communities together in ways we struggle to achieve today, even with all our technology. Imagine this, you are sitting in a room lit by a single lamp or a few candles. The fire crackles in the background. Your father sits in the best chair, holding the latest installment of a serialized novel. It arrived yesterday, a thin pamphlet, maybe 30 pages, costing just a shilling. Everyone in the room has been thinking about this moment for a month, because that is how long it has been since the last installment. 30 days of wondering whether the hero survived, whether the lovers reunited, whether justice was served, and now, finally, you get to find out. Your father clears his throat. He begins to read. And for the next hour, everyone in the room, your mother, your siblings, possibly the servants, maybe even a neighbour or two, everyone listens, completely focused. No one is checking their phone. No one can check their phone, obviously, because phones do not exist. There is just the voice, the story, and the shared experience of entering another world together. This was Victorian Netflix, and it was everywhere, in wealthy homes and working-class cottages, in city apartments and rural farmhouses. Across England, America, and Europe, millions of people structured their evenings around reading aloud. And the effects on culture, on literacy, on family bonds, on the very structure of how novels were written, those effects are still with us today, whether we realize it or not. Let me give you some numbers that will blow your mind. In the early 1800s, literacy rates in England were relatively low. Maybe 60% of men could read, and closer to 45% of women. But by 1870, after the Education Act made elementary schooling compulsory, those numbers shot up. By the end of the Victorian era, around 1900, over 90% of both men and women could read. 90%. In less than a century, England went from a largely illiterate population to near universal literacy. And reading aloud was one of the key mechanisms that made this possible. Here is why. If one person in a household could read, everyone in that household could access books. Literacy became communal rather than individual. A working-class family might only have one literate member, maybe the oldest son who had attended school, or the mother who had learned as a girl, but that one person could read aloud to everyone else. And as they listened, the non-readers picked up patterns. They learned how sentences work. They absorbed vocabulary. They started to understand the relationship between spoken words and written symbols. Reading aloud was informal education happening every single evening in homes across the country, and it was not just families reading to each other, it was everywhere. In factories, one worker might read the newspaper aloud during breaks while others listened and discussed. In public houses, what we would call bars or pubs, someone would read aloud from the latest penny dreadful, those sensational weekly serials about detectives and criminals and supernatural events. Street corners had readers who would recite news or stories to crowds who gathered to listen. Reading aloud was a public performance, a shared experience, a social glue. But let us focus on the home for a moment, because that is where reading aloud had its most profound impact. The typical Victorian family reading session had a structure. Usually, the father read. This was his role, his performance, his moment of authority. One historian, Philip Collins, notes that in many genteel houses, Papa would read the instalments of successive novels to the assembled family. Papa, the father figure presiding over the literary experience. But here is something interesting. Mothers also read aloud, though it is mentioned less frequently in historical accounts. Why? Because men's activities were documented more thoroughly. But women absolutely read aloud to their children, to each other, to mixed family groups. They just did not get the same historical recognition for it. And children were the primary audience for much of this reading, but they were not passive listeners. They were learning. One of the photographs we have of Charles Dickens shows him sitting in a chair in his garden, reading to his two daughters, Mamie and Katie. They are listening intently, and Dickens is not just reading, he is performing. His face is animated, his voice modulates, he brings the characters to life. Because this is crucial to understand, reading aloud in the Victorian era was not monotone. It was not like someone mechanically converting text to sound, it was performance art. The reader was expected to do different voices for different characters, to pause for dramatic effect, to modulate tone and volume, to create suspense, to make people laugh or cry or gasp. A good reader was highly valued. If you could read aloud well, you were invited places. You became popular. Your skill was a social asset. And the novels themselves were written for this. Charles Dickens knew his work would be read aloud. So he wrote dialogue that sounded natural when spoken. He created characters with distinctive speech patterns. He used punctuation, lots of dashes, ellipses, exclamation points, to guide the reader's performance. He ended chapters on cliffhangers specifically designed to leave the listening audience desperate for more. Pickwick Papers, Dickens's breakthrough novel, was published in monthly instalments from April 1836 to November 1837. It cost 1 shilling per instalment. A complete novel in book form might cost 31 shillings and sixpence, nearly a month's wages for many workers, but spread over 19 months at a shilling each, affordable. And that affordability meant that families who could never buy a complete book could participate in literary culture. They bought each instalment. They read it aloud. They discussed it. They waited eagerly for the next one, and waiting was part of the magic. When an instalment ended on a cliffhanger, everyone had to wait a month to find out what happened next. Can you imagine? A month. You could not binge the next episode. You could not look up spoilers online. You had to sit with the uncertainty, the anticipation. And you know what? That built community, because everyone was waiting together. You could discuss theories with neighbours, you could speculate, you could bond over shared suspense. Let me tell you about one specific moment that captures this perfectly. When Dickens's novel The Old Curiosity Shop was being serialised, the final instalments involved the fate of little Nell, beloved child character. Would she die? Would she be saved? The tension was unbearable. When the ship carrying the final instalment arrived in New York Harbour, crowds gathered at the dock, and as passengers disembarked, People shouted from the shore, "Is little Nell dead?" They could not wait another moment to know. The ship passengers shouted back the answer, and people wept openly on the docks. This is what reading aloud created. Shared emotional experiences on a massive scale. Before mass media, before radio, before television, reading aloud was how culture spread. It was how stories became communal property. It was how a nation or a community could all be thinking about the same characters, the same plot twists, the same moral questions. Now, there was a darker side to this. Reading aloud also functioned as censorship. Because novels were read aloud in family settings, with children present, with servants listening, with the assumption of a mixed audience, publishers and authors knew that certain content would not be acceptable. Anything too sexual, too violent, too morally ambiguous risked rejection. Publishers literally told authors that their work needed to be suitable for reading aloud in any family circle. Thomas Hardy and George Moore, novelists later in the Victorian period, complained bitterly about this constraint. Hardy tried to publish Jude the Obscure, a novel dealing with sexuality, marriage and religion in complex ways. Harper's, the publisher, rejected it because it contained material which could not be read aloud in any family circle. Hardy was furious. He felt that the practice of family reading was stifling English literature, forcing authors to write watered-down moralistic stories rather than confronting difficult truths. And he had a point. Reading aloud shaped what got published. It shaped what stories were told. It favoured certain plots, clear, good versus evil, eventual triumph of virtue, romantic love that ended in marriage, villains who were punished. Ambiguity was harder. Moral complexity was risky. Because if a father could not comfortably read it aloud to his 13-year-old daughter, it would not sell. But within those constraints, incredible stories were still told. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, wrote novels that pushed boundaries while still being technically acceptable for family reading. Jane Eyre deals with power, class, gender, hidden wives and moral choices, but it does so in a way that could be read aloud. Jane Austen's novels are sharp social satire, skewering the marriage market and class pretensions, but on the surface they are proper courtship stories suitable for family consumption. These authors were working within the system and subverting it simultaneously, and readers, listening readers, could catch the subtext. They could hear the irony in Austen's voice. They could sense the rebellion in Bronte's characters. The best authors wrote on multiple levels so that children heard an adventure story while adults heard social critique. Now, what did this actually look like in practice? Let me walk you through a typical evening. The family has finished supper. The table is cleared. In wealthier homes, everyone moves to the parlour or drawing room. In working-class homes, they might stay in the kitchen or the main living space. The reader takes position, usually in the best chair, closest to the light source. Everyone else arranges themselves around the room. Women often bring needlework, we are back to that, so their hands stay busy while they listen. Men might smoke a pipe. Children sit on the floor or on low stools. The reader begins. Maybe it is the latest instalment of a Dickens novel. Maybe it is a Gothic thriller. Maybe it is a collection of poems. Maybe it is just the newspaper reading the important articles aloud so everyone stays informed about politics and events. The reading lasts anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the material and the audience's interest. And here is what is remarkable. During this time, everyone is experiencing the same story at the same pace. No one can skip ahead. No one can read faster or slower than the group. You're all in it together. If a character does something shocking, everyone gasps at the same moment. If something is funny, you laugh together. If it is sad, you might all cry. This synchronous emotional experience, we hardly have that anymore. Even when we watch television together, people are often half distracted by phones. But reading aloud demanded full attention because if you zoned out, you lost the thread of the story. And breaks in the reading sparked discussion. Someone might stop and say, "Wait, why did the character do that?" And the family would debate. They would share interpretations. They would predict what might happen next. The story was not passively consumed. It was actively engaged with. It was social and participatory in a way that solitary reading, what we mostly do now, can never be. Let me share something that will resonate with modern experiences. Do you remember when Game of Thrones was airing and everyone watched each episode at the same time, and then the next day at work or school, people would gather and discuss what happened? That water cooler conversation, that shared cultural moment, that is exactly what Victorian reading aloud created, except it happened every night in homes across the country, and it happened with books rather than television. But there is another layer to this. Reading aloud was also a form of control, particularly for young women. The Victorian era was deeply concerned about what young women read. Solitary reading was seen as dangerous. If a young woman read alone, silently, she might encounter ideas that were improper. She might develop thoughts that challenge social norms. But if reading happened aloud, supervised by a parent or male authority figure, her literary consumption could be monitored and guided. She could only hear what was deemed appropriate. Some young women chafed against this. They wanted to read freely, privately, without supervision. And as silent reading became more common toward the end of the 19th century, they gained that freedom. But it came with judgment. Silent reading was sometimes called selfish or antisocial. The idea was that reading aloud was communal and virtuous, while silent reading was isolating and potentially morally suspect. Interesting, is it not? We think of reading as a fundamentally solitary activity. But for most of human history it was not, it was communal. And the shift to silent, private reading was actually controversial. People worried it would destroy family bonds, they worried it would lead to social fragmentation. And you know what? They were not entirely wrong. We did lose something when we stopped reading aloud together regularly. Here is a detail that shows how embedded reading aloud was in the culture. Charles Dickens, in his later years, gave public reading tours. He travelled around England and America, performing excerpts from his novels to huge crowds. People paid to hear him read his own work aloud. These events were packed, emotional. Dickens would read the death of little Nell, and grown men in the audience would weep openly. He would read comic passages, and the room would explode with laughter. This was entertainment before recorded sound, before film, before television. The human voice bringing a story to life was the highest form of mass entertainment available. And here is something most people do not know. Dickens wrote his novels with these public readings in mind. He thought about how sentences would sound when performed. He thought about pacing for oral delivery. He thought about moments that would get big reactions from a live audience. Scholars who study his punctuation note that he paid meticulous attention to every dash, every pause, every emphasis mark, because these were performance notes. His written text was, in a very real sense, a musical score for the voice. So when a father read Dickens aloud to his family, he was performing a role that Dickens had carefully scripted. The pauses were indicated, the emphases were suggested, the rhythm was built in. Reading aloud was not just transmitting information, it was executing a performance that the author had choreographed. Now I need to be honest about class differences here. The kind of reading aloud I have been describing, leisurely evening sessions with popular novels, that was more common in middle-class and upper-class homes. Working-class families had less time and less access to books, but they still participated in reading aloud culture, just in different forms. Penny dreadfuls and cheap weekly serials were designed for working-class audiences. These stories were sensational, action-packed, sometimes lurid. They cost very little, 1 penny, hence the name, and they were passed around, shared, read aloud in public spaces and crowded homes. And here is what matters. Whether you were reading Dickens in a comfortable parlour or a penny dreadful in a cramped tenement, the act of reading aloud created community. It brought people together. It gave them common stories, common references, a common culture. The decline of reading aloud began gradually. As literacy rates rose and more people could read for themselves, the necessity of reading aloud decreased. As electric lights made evening reading easier, you did not need someone positioned perfectly by a candle. Individual reading became more practical. As books became cheaper and more available through public libraries, families could afford multiple books so people could read different things simultaneously rather than gathering around a single text. And then came radio in the 1920s and 30s, which offered voice and story but removed the physical presence of the reader. Then television in the 1950s, which added images, and now streaming services, which give us unlimited stories, instantly available, consumed individually on personal devices. We have never had more access to stories, but we have also never been more isolated in our consumption of them. What have we lost? We have lost the ritual, the gathering, the shared pacing, the experience of moving through a story together. We have lost the art of vocal performance. How many people today could read aloud for an hour and keep an audience engaged? We have lost the discussions that happen when everyone has experienced the same material at the same time, and we have lost the intergenerational sharing, children experiencing adult stories adapted through a parent's voice, older family members passing down culture through the stories they choose to read and how they read them. But here is the beautiful thing. Reading aloud never completely died, it just transformed. Parents still read to young children, picture books, bedtime stories. Teachers read to students. Book clubs sometimes include reading passages aloud. Audiobooks are a massive industry, bringing professional vocal performances of novels to millions of listeners. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, when families were isolated together, many rediscovered reading aloud. Parents read chapter books to older children. Couples read novels to each other. People found comfort in the old ritual. Because it turns out the human voice telling a story is powerful, it always has been. It is how we passed down history before writing existed. It is how we taught morals, culture, identity. It is how we connected, how we bonded, how we made meaning together. Reading aloud taps into something ancient and fundamental about being human. As the Thompson family finishes their reading for the evening, as the father closes the book and everyone stretches and begins discussing what they just heard, as the candles burn low and someone rises to tend the fire, something else is happening in other homes. Because not all evenings were spent in quiet, controlled reading. Some evenings were loud, raucous, full of laughter and competition and quick thinking. Some evenings, families gathered not to hear a story but to play games. And the games they played, word games, logic games, performance games, those games reveal yet another layer of evening culture that we have almost completely forgotten. A layer that was about quick wit, clever thinking, and the pure joy of structured fun in a world that demanded so much seriousness. And that is where we need to go next. So keep your energy up. We are about to enter the parlour, where the real entertainment is about to begin. Laughter erupts from the parlour. Someone has just guessed completely wrong, and the room dissolves into giggles. It is 9 o'clock on a winter evening in 1878. The reading is finished, the teacups have been cleared, and now comes the part of the evening when minds sharpen, when wit matters more than wealth, and when a clever 14-year-old girl can absolutely demolish her pompous uncle at a game that requires nothing but quick thinking. Welcome to the golden age of parlour games, and I need you to forget everything you think you know about Victorian propriety and stiffness. Because when the game started, the gloves came off, sometimes literally, depending on which game was being played. Here is what you need to understand. These people had no screens, no apps, no ways to passively consume entertainment. If they wanted to be entertained, they had to create it themselves, and they got really, really good at it. The parlour games of the 1800s were not simple time wasters. They were sophisticated intellectual exercises, social experiments, performance opportunities, and occasionally absolute chaos. And they reveal a side of our ancestors that we rarely see. Playful, creative, sometimes ridiculous, and deeply human. Let me start with the most famous one, charades. But here is the thing. Victorian charades were not what you're picturing. You're thinking of the modern version where you act out movie titles silently while people shout guesses, right? That is not what charades meant in the 1800s, not even close. Regency and Victorian charades were verbal riddles. They were elaborate word puzzles spoken aloud, usually in the form of poems. Here is how it worked. You would take a word and break it into syllables. Then you would create enigmatic descriptions of each syllable, and finally describe the whole word without ever stating what the word actually was. The listeners had to figure out what word you were describing based on these cryptic clues. Let me give you a real example from the Austen family. Yes, Jane Austen's family loved charades. Here is one that has been attributed to members of the Austen household. In confinement I am chained every day, yet my enemies need not be crowing. I know no poor prisoner more favoured than I, or one who is more worthy of pitying. Can you guess what word this describes? Think about it for a moment. The answer is hen coop. Hen is the first syllable, a female chicken, which is kept in confinement, chained, meaning confined. Coop is the second syllable, and the whole word is hen coop. See how clever that is? You had to think linguistically, break down words, understand double meanings, play with language. This was not passive entertainment. This was active mental gymnastics. And these riddles could get incredibly complex. Some charades were written as multi-stanza poems that took 5 minutes to recite. The best ones were so clever that even very intelligent people struggled to solve them. Families kept charade books where they wrote down their favourites. They passed these books around, challenged friends with particularly difficult ones, and competed to create the most elegant or deceptive riddles. Now, here is what makes this fascinating from a social perspective. Charades were one of the few arenas where youth could legitimately outsmart their elders. A clever teenage girl who was good with words could solve a charade that stumped her father. And she could create one that made the whole room stop and think. In a society where age and gender determined so much of your authority and respect, parlour games created temporary spaces where intelligence mattered more than status. The actress charades that we know today, the silent acting version, did not become popular until the mid to late 1800s, and even then, they were not the main form. Verbal charades remained the preferred version well into the early 20th century. Only gradually did the acting component take over, and the verbal riddles fade away. But charades were just the beginning. Let me tell you about blindman's bluff. You might know a version of this. One person is blindfolded and tries to catch others while they run around. Simple, right? But the Victorian version had layers of social complexity that would surprise you. Here is how it worked. One player was blindfolded and spun around several times to disorient them. Then they had to try to catch another player. Once they caught someone, they had to identify who that person was by touching their face, hair, or clothing, while still blindfolded. If they guessed correctly, that person became the next blindfolded player. If they guessed wrong, they remained blindfolded and tried again. Now, think about what this meant in a society where touching someone of the opposite sex was usually forbidden. Blind man's bluff created a socially acceptable space for physical contact that would otherwise be scandalous. A young man could touch a young woman's face, could run his fingers through her hair, could put his hands on her shoulders, all while blindfolded, in full view of chaperones and family members. It was thrilling precisely because it pushed the boundaries of propriety while remaining technically innocent, and the opportunities for flirtation were endless. A young woman could position herself so that the blindfolded young man she fancied would catch her. She could make small sounds to guide him toward her, or if she wanted to avoid someone, she could stay completely silent and still. The game was as much about navigation of social dynamics as it was about physical agility. One etiquette guide from the 1880s warned that blindman's bluff could become too boisterous and should only be played in homes with sturdy furniture that could withstand some bumping. That warning tells you everything about how physical and energetic this game could get. Victorian parlours were not always quiet and controlled. Sometimes they were full of running, shrieking, laughing chaos. Another wildly popular game was 20 Questions. The rules were simple and elegant. One person thinks of an object. The other players can ask up to 20 yes or no questions to figure out what it is. The person who guesses correctly gets to think of the next object. But what made this brilliant was the strategy involved. You had to ask questions that narrowed possibilities efficiently. Is it alive? Is it larger than a bread box? Is it made by humans? Each question was a logical step, eliminating whole categories of possibilities. Good players developed systems. They would start with broad categories, then narrow progressively. Bad players asked random specific questions and wasted their 20 chances. And watching people play revealed their thinking patterns. A merchant might ask about value and utility, a scholar might ask about origin and composition, a romantic might ask about beauty and sentiment. The questions you asked revealed how your mind worked, what you valued, what you noticed about the world. Families playing regularly develop shared knowledge and inside jokes. If your brother once spent 15 questions trying to guess butter churn and still failed, that became family lore. If your aunt always asked the same 3 opening questions in the same order, people would tease her about it. The game created a microculture within the family. Now let me tell you about a game that absolutely delights me because it is so bizarre and so Victorian. It is called tableaux vivants, which is French for living pictures. Here is the concept. Players would create a frozen scene, a famous painting, a historical event, a moment from literature, using themselves as the subjects. They would dress up, arrange themselves carefully, and then freeze in position while the audience admired the scene and tried to guess what they were depicting. This required planning, creativity, costumes, props, and the ability to hold perfectly still, and Victorians took it very seriously. They would spend hours preparing elaborate tableaux. They would create lighting effects with candles and lamps. They would use household items to create convincing props, and then they would hold their poses, sometimes for several minutes while people examined the scene from different angles. Why did they love this? Because it combined several Victorian obsessions. Art appreciation, you had to know famous paintings and scenes to create good tableaux. Historical knowledge. Many tableaux depicted moments from history or mythology. Physical control and grace. Holding a pose required discipline. And performance. You were literally making yourself into art. And it was one of the few acceptable ways to engage in something close to theatre. For many religious families, actual theatre was considered morally suspect. But tableaux vivants, those were educational. Those were artistic, those were acceptable. So young people who loved drama and performance could satisfy that urge through living pictures. Here is another game that shows how clever these people were. It is called Bullet Pudding. Jane Austen's niece, Fanny Austen Knight, mentioned this game in her diary. She wrote that the family had different amusements every evening, and she specifically lists bullet pudding as one of them. Here is how it worked. You made a cone of flour on a plate and put a bullet, an actual lead bullet, on top. Players took turns slicing away pieces of the flour cone with a knife. The person who made the bullet fall had to retrieve it using only their mouth, getting flour all over their face in the process. It were messy, ridiculous, and apparently hilarious. Can you imagine proper Victorian families in their nice parlours deliberately getting flour all over their faces for fun? It completely upends our image of stiff, formal people who never relaxed. They were playful, they were silly, they were willing to look ridiculous for a laugh. And that is the theme I want you to notice. Parlour games created spaces where normal social rules were temporarily suspended, where status mattered less, where women could be clever and competitive, where young people could take centre stage, where physical contact was allowed, where silliness was encouraged. The parlour game was a pressure release valve in a society that demanded constant propriety. Let me tell you about one more game that reveals a lot about the Victorian mind. It is called Consequences, and it is a writing game. Here is how it played. Everyone gets a piece of paper. You write a man's name at the top, could be someone famous, someone fictional, or someone in the room. Then you fold the paper so the name is hidden and pass it to the next person. That person writes a woman's name, folds the paper and passes it on. The next person writes where they met. The next writes what he said to her. The next writes what she said to him. The next writes what the consequence was. Finally, someone writes what the world said about it. At the end, you unfold all the papers and read them aloud. And because each person only saw what they wrote, the combinations are usually absurd and hilarious. You might end up with, Napoleon met Queen Victoria in a chicken coop. He said, "Your hat is on fire." She said, "I have been expecting you." The consequence was they started a bakery. The world said, "What took them so long?" The joy was in the randomness, the creativity, the unexpected combinations. But notice what the game reveals. It has a formula: man meets woman, they speak, there is a consequence, society reacts. This is the structure of courtship and marriage, which was the central drama of Victorian social life. The game lets you play with that structure, make it silly, subvert it. It is social satire disguised as entertainment. And these games were not occasional diversions. They were regular features of evening life. Wealthy families might play several nights a week. Middle-class families with less leisure time might play on weekends or special occasions. But everyone knew how to play. Everyone participated. Gaming literacy was a form of social literacy. Here is what I find beautiful about this. The parlour game era was the golden age of free, creative, face-to-face entertainment. You did not need to buy anything. You did not need special equipment, except maybe a blindfold or some paper and pencils. You just needed people, a room, and imagination. The barrier to entry was near zero. Rich and poor alike could play most of these games. Compare that to today. We have unlimited entertainment options, but most of them are purchased, packaged, produced by someone else. We consume rather than create. We watch rather than play. And most of our entertainment is designed for individual consumption, even when we are technically together. How many families sit in the same room, each person on a different device consuming different content? The room is shared, but the experience is isolated. Parlour games forced togetherness, forced interaction, forced creativity, and yes, they could be annoying. Imagine being forced to play charades with your irritating cousin every Sunday for years. Imagine having to laugh politely at your uncle's terrible puns during word games. Imagine being the person who always lost at 20 questions and having to endure the family's teasing. It was not always delightful, but it created bonds, shared memories, family culture. The inside jokes that came from years of playing together gave families a private language, a shared history. When siblings scattered to different cities or countries, they carried those memories with them. And when they reunited years later, someone could say, "Remember the time we played blindman's bluff and father knocked over the vase?" And everyone would laugh because they all remembered. Now, you might be wondering, why did parlour games decline? Why did we stop doing this? The answer is technology, but not in the way you might think. It was not just that television offered easier entertainment. It was that technology changed the rhythm of evenings. Electric lights meant evenings were no longer special, bounded time. You could read or work late into the night. The distinction between daytime and evening blurred. Telephones meant you could socialize without gathering in person. Radio offered professional entertainment. Cars made it easier to go out rather than entertain at home. Gradually, the evening gathering became less necessary, less frequent, and finally almost extinct. By the mid-20th century, parlour games were considered old-fashioned, quaint, something grandparents might remember, but young people had no interest in. And for several decades they nearly disappeared. But here is the twist: they are coming back. Board game cafes are thriving in cities around the world, escape rooms are a booming industry, trivia nights pack bars and restaurants. People are hungry for in-person, collaborative, creative entertainment. They are tired of screens. They want to look at faces, hear laughter, solve puzzles together. The specific games are different. We are not gathering to solve verbal charades in poetic form, but the impulse is the same. The desire to use our minds playfully in community with others. The desire to create rather than consume. The desire to be present, to connect, to share an experience that is spontaneous and unrepeatable. And some families are literally bringing back Victorian parlour games. There are websites dedicated to explaining the rules. There are books collecting historical games. People are hosting parlour game nights with period costumes, serving period food, learning the games their great-great-grandparents played, and they are discovering that these games are actually really fun. That charades based on wordplay are intellectually satisfying in a way that modern charades are not. That games requiring no equipment are freeing. That silliness is underrated. As the evening of games winds down in that parlour in 1878, as people begin to yawn and gather their things, as candles burn low and someone mentions it is getting late, there is a sense of satisfaction, not from winning, though winners are pleased, but from the shared experience, from the laughter, the thinking, the absurdity, the connection, from being together in a way that mattered. And as they prepare to end the evening, one more ritual remains, because in many homes, particularly religious ones, the day does not close with games. It closes with something more solemn, more grounding, more reflective. It closes with prayer, with Bible reading, with a moment of quiet contemplation that acknowledges something beyond the everyday. And that spiritual dimension of evening life, how women led devotionals, how religion structured time, how faith provided meaning in hard lives, that is territory we must explore. Because for countless women, the evening prayer circle was not just a ritual, it was empowerment. It was one of the few spaces where their voices led, where their spiritual authority was recognized, where they could speak and be heard. So let us bow our heads and enter that quiet, powerful space together. The clock strikes 10, the games have ended, the laughter fades, and now, in households across Protestant England and America, a shift occurs, the mood changes. Backs straighten, voices quiet, because it is time for evening devotions. And in this moment, this daily ritual that happened in millions of homes for hundreds of years, women found something unexpected. They found their voice, they found authority, they found a space where they could lead, teach, and speak with power. In a world that silenced them almost everywhere else, the evening prayer circle let them be heard. But here is what you need to understand. This was not always gentle or comforting. Evening devotions were complex, sometimes oppressive, occasionally liberating, and always deeply meaningful in ways we struggle to comprehend today. Because faith was not a Sunday-only activity, it was woven into every aspect of daily life, and the evening closing ritual shaped how people understood their existence, their purpose, and their place in the universe. Let me paint the scene. The family gathers. In some homes, this includes servants, who are required to attend whether they want to or not. Everyone sits. The head of household, usually the father, opens the family Bible. He reads a passage aloud. Then he leads the family in prayer. Everyone kneels, heads bow, and for the next 10 to 30 minutes, the spiritual work of the day happens. This was called family worship or household devotions, and it was expected in respectable Protestant homes. Not optional, expected. If you visited someone's home and stayed past a certain hour, you participated in their evening devotions. If you were a servant in the house, you attended. If you were a child, you had no choice. This was as mandatory as dinner. Now, why am I telling you this in a series about women's evening activities? Because here is the fascinating part. While men usually led family worship, women had significant roles that gave them rare authority. And in some contexts, prayer circles, charitable societies, Sunday school teaching that happened on weekday evenings, women led entirely. They prayed aloud, they interpreted scripture, they made theological arguments. They exercised spiritual leadership in ways that were forbidden to them in almost every other sphere. Let me give you a specific example. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, was one of the most powerful political organizations of the late 19th century, and it started as prayer circles. Women gathering in the evenings to pray about the problem of alcoholism, which was destroying families across America. These were not quiet, private prayers. These were organized, strategic public prayers. Women would march to saloons, form circles outside, and pray loudly for the establishment to close. They would sing hymns, they would kneel in the street. And here is what makes this remarkable. These were respectable middle-class women, women who in any other context would be expected to be silent, obedient, confined to the home. But in the name of Christian duty and prayer, they could occupy public space, they could confront men, they could make demands, they could organize politically, all under the cover of religious devotion. Think about the genius of this in a society that forbade women from speaking in public, from entering politics, from challenging male authority. Prayer was the loophole. Because who could argue against prayer? Who could tell a woman she could not pray for the moral improvement of society? The evening prayer meeting became a training ground for female activism that would eventually lead to suffrage, to social reform movements, to women claiming their full civic rights. But let us go back to the home, because that is where most evening religious practice happened. And it was not always empowering. For many women, evening devotions were one more obligation in a day full of obligations. You have cooked, cleaned, cared for children, done needlework, managed a household. You are exhausted, and now you must sit through 30 minutes of prayer and Bible reading trying to appear spiritually engaged when all you want is to collapse into bed. And the content of those prayers and readings often reinforced women's subordination. Passages about wives obeying husbands, sermons about female modesty and submission, prayers thanking God for the natural order that placed men above women. Evening devotions could be a daily reminder of your lesser status, dressed up in holy language. But here is where it gets complicated. Because for other women, evening devotions were genuine comfort. Life in the 1800s was hard, child mortality was high. You might lose half your children before they reached adulthood. Disease, accidents, economic instability, these were constant threats. And in that context, the promise of heaven, the belief in a loving God who saw your suffering, the community of faith that supported you, these were not oppressive. These were lifelines. I found a diary entry from a woman in Vermont written in 1863 during the Civil War. Her husband was fighting for the Union. She had not heard from him in 3 months. She wrote, "Evening devotions are the only time I feel peace. When we pray together, the children and I feel he is with us still. I feel God holds him safe. I can bear another day knowing we will pray again tonight. For her, evening devotions were not oppression, they were survival. And women often shaped the content of family worship more than we might expect. Yes, the father read the Bible, but the mother often chose which passages to read. She suggested which hymns to sing. She guided the prayers, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly. In the evening religious space, women exercised a quiet but real influence over their family's spiritual formation. Let me tell you about Sabbath evenings specifically, because those were different. Sunday evenings in strict Protestant households were rigidly controlled. No games, no secular reading, no work beyond absolute necessity. The entire evening was devoted to religious activity. More Bible reading, more prayers. Sometimes the family would catechize the children, asking them questions about Christian doctrine and requiring memorized answers. For children, this could be tedious or terrifying depending on the family. Imagine being 7 years old, tired from a long day of church and strict behaviour, and now you have to recite the Westminster Catechism perfectly or face your father's disapproval. Some children grew up hating Sundays because of the oppressive religious atmosphere, but other families made Sabbath evenings warm and meaningful. The mother might tell Bible stories in ways that captivated children's imaginations. The father might explain scripture in gentle, thoughtful ways. The hymns sung together might be beautiful. The sense of setting aside one evening per week for spiritual reflection might feel sacred rather than oppressive. And here is what I find most interesting. The strictness of Sabbath evenings created a rhythm to the week. 6 days of varied evening activities, needlework, reading, games, visiting. Then Sunday evening, which was different, set apart, holy. This created a temporal structure that many people found meaningful. It marked time, it created contrast, it gave shape to existence. Now let me talk about prayer circles specifically, because these were powerful spaces for women. In many communities, women organized weekly evening prayer meetings. Sometimes these were at the church, sometimes they rotated between members' homes, and these were women-only spaces, no men present, which meant women could speak freely. What did they pray about? Everything. The salvation of their children's souls, the conversion of their husbands or neighbors, the success of missionary work abroad, social problems like poverty, prostitution, alcoholism. And as they prayed together, they also talked. They shared information, they coordinated charitable activities, they organized. These prayer circles were simultaneously spiritual gatherings and organizing meetings, and women learned to speak. To pray aloud in front of others requires confidence. It requires the ability to formulate thoughts coherently on the spot. It requires spiritual authority, the belief that your words matter, that God hears you, that you have something worth saying. For women who were silenced in every other context, learning to pray aloud in these circles was transformative. They found their voice literally. Some of these prayer circles led directly to social action. Women would pray about poverty, and then they would organize food drives. They would pray about illiteracy, and then they would start reading programs. They would pray about vice, and then they would march on saloons. The line between prayer and activism was porous. Prayer was not passive. Prayer was how women gathered, strategized, and then acted. But I want to be honest about something. Not all evening religious practice was about community and empowerment. For many women, it was also about fear. Evangelical Protestant theology in the 19th century emphasized hell, damnation, and the constant possibility of losing your salvation. Evening prayers often included desperate pleas for God's mercy, confessions of unworthiness, expressions of terror about the afterlife. One woman's diary from the 1840s records her nightly prayers. I begged God again to show me if I am truly saved. The fear consumes me. What if I am deceived? What if my faith is false? What if I am damned? This is not comforting bedtime spirituality. This is existential terror. And for women raised in strict religious environments, this fear could dominate their inner lives. The evening examination of conscience, reviewing your day for sins, confessing them, begging forgiveness, this was a nightly ritual for many devout women. And while it could be meaningful and lead to genuine moral growth, it could also be psychologically damaging. Constant self-scrutiny, constant guilt, constant fear of divine punishment. This was the dark side of evening religious practice. But here is what I want you to notice. Even in that fear, even in that oppression, women were engaging with big questions. What is the meaning of life? What happens after death? How should I live? What is my purpose? Evening devotions forced engagement with existential and ethical questions that modern life often lets us avoid. We distract ourselves constantly. We numb ourselves with entertainment. But these women sat with the big questions every single evening, and that produced a kind of depth, a kind of seriousness about existence that we've largely lost, and they passed this down. Mothers teaching children to pray, grandmothers explaining scripture to grandchildren. Women were the primary religious educators in the home. Sunday school teachers were mostly women. Prayer circle leaders were women. Women shaped the next generation's faith. This was real power, even if it was not recognized as such. Let me give you a statistic that might surprise you. In evangelical Protestant churches in the 19th century, women made up anywhere from 60 to 75% of active members. Men attended church, but women were the core, the engine, the committed believers. And much of that commitment was built and maintained through evening devotional practices. The prayer circles, the Bible studies, the missionary societies that met in the evenings, these created networks of women connected by shared faith and shared purpose. Now, what happened to all of this? Why did evening devotions decline? The same factors that eroded other evening rituals played a role. Electric lights meant evenings were less bounded. Radio and television offered alternative ways to spend evening time. Declining church attendance in the 20th century meant religious practice became less central. Families became more fragmented, with members having different schedules and activities. But there is another factor. As women gained access to other forms of power, education, careers, political rights, the appeal of religion as a space for female authority decreased. Why lead a prayer circle when you could run for office? Why organize a missionary society when you could join a professional organization? The very success of women's movements meant that religion lost some of its unique appeal as a space where women could lead, but not entirely. Even today, religious communities, particularly evangelical, Protestant, Catholic and Orthodox Christian, as well as many Jewish and Muslim communities, are sustained primarily by women. Women who organize, teach, pray, and create the social fabric of faith communities. The tradition has not disappeared. It has transformed, and there has been a recent resurgence of interest in contemplative practices, in mindfulness, in meditation. People are rediscovering that the evening is a good time for reflection, for spiritual practice, for quieting the mind before sleep. These are not always traditionally religious practices, but they echo the old rhythms, the understanding that the day should close with something more than entertainment, that there should be time for meaning-making, for perspective, for connection to something larger than yourself. As the family in our 1870 evening finishes their devotions, as the father closes the Bible and the mother blows out the devotional candle, as children rise from kneeling and head toward bed, there is a sense of completion. The day has been bracketed. Morning prayers began it, evening prayers close it, and whatever happened in between, whatever joys or sorrows or ordinary tedium, it has been placed in a larger frame, a frame of meaning, purpose, divine order. And as the women of the household prepare for bed, as they move through the final tasks of the evening, checking on sleeping children, banking the fire, maybe pausing at a window to look at the stars, They carry with them the words of the prayers, the verses read, the sense of being part of something eternal. And that sense, that anchoring in something beyond the everyday, that was powerful, that was real, that mattered deeply. But the evening is not quite finished yet, because after the prayers, after the spiritual work, there was still the body's work to be done. Meals needed to be prepared for the next day, bread needed to be set to rise, food needed to be preserved. The kitchen never fully closed, and the skills required to manage evening food preparation, the knowledge of how to make tomorrow's meals while finishing today's work, that was another layer of women's expertise, one that involved chemistry, biology, timing, and a kind of domestic magic that we've almost completely lost. So let us return to the kitchen one more time to watch women work at the intersection of necessity and art as they prepared food by firelight and ensured their families would not go hungry when morning came. The prayers are finished, the children are in bed, but the kitchen lamp still burns, because while the family sleeps, a woman stands at her wooden table, hands deep in bread dough, kneading the mixture that will rise overnight and become breakfast. And this right here, this quiet, solitary work in the late evening hours, this is the labour that nobody sees, nobody celebrates, and absolutely nobody can skip. Because if she does not do this now, there will be no food in the morning. It is that simple and that brutal. You see, we have talked about the beautiful parts of evening life, the reading, the games, the letters, the community. But we cannot ignore this. The relentless, physical, necessary work that continued long after everyone else had finished their day. Work that happened by dim lamplight, when backs already ached and hands were already rough. Work that was never done, never complete, never enough. And if you want to understand women's lives before television, before convenience, before any of our modern shortcuts, you have to understand the evening kitchen, because that is where survival happened. Let me be very clear about something. The idea that cooking dominated a woman's time is not an exaggeration. One study of household labour in the late 1800s found that the average housewife spent between 4 and 6 hours per day on food-related tasks. 4 to 6 hours every single day. And that is not counting the evening work, the preparation for the next day, the preservation tasks, the planning and organising that happened after regular meals were done. Here is what a typical evening might look like. Supper has been served and cleaned up. That alone might have taken until 7 or 8 o'clock. Now, while there is still energy and light, certain tasks must be completed. Bread dough needs to be mixed and set to rise for the morning. Tomorrow's meals need to be at least partially prepared, vegetables chopped, meat cut, ingredients assembled. If it is harvest season, there might be canning or preserving to do. If it is winter, there might be food storage to check, spoilage to prevent, supplies to rotate. And here is the thing that will shock you. Much of this work required active management of fire and heat. We are back to fire again, but now in a different context. Not the hearth fire for warmth, but the kitchen fire for cooking. And managing a cooking fire at night, when you are exhausted, when visibility is poor, when you just want to sleep, that took a special kind of endurance. Let me tell you about bread specifically, because bread is the perfect example of how evening work shaped the next day's life. In the 1800s, almost no one bought bread from a bakery. You made it at home. And making bread is a multi-stage process that requires planning and timing. First, you need to keep a sourdough starter alive. This is a culture of wild yeast that lives in a jar or crock. You feed it regularly with flour and water. If it dies, you have to get a new starter from a neighbour, or start one from scratch, which can take weeks. Many women treated their sourdough starter like a pet. It had needs, it required care, and if you neglected it, you could not make bread. In the evening, you would take some of this starter and mix it with flour, water and salt. The exact proportions depended on how many loaves you needed, what kind of flour you had and the temperature of your kitchen. Too warm and the dough would overrise and become sour. Too cold and it would not rise at all. You learned by experience, by failure, by watching your mother and grandmother. There were no precise recipes. It was knowledge held in your hands and in your judgment. Once mixed, the dough needed to be kneaded. Have you ever kneaded bread dough? It is physical work. 10 to 15 minutes of pushing, folding, stretching. Your arms get tired. Your shoulders ache. And you are doing this at 10 o'clock at night after a full day of labour. But you do it because if you do not knead enough, the bread will be dense and heavy. Your family will complain. Your children will not get the nutrition they need. Then the dough goes into a bowl covered with a cloth and placed somewhere with the right temperature to rise slowly overnight. In winter, that might be near the stove. In summer, it might be in the coolest corner of the kitchen. You check it before you go to bed. You check it if you wake during the night. Because if it over-rises, you have to punch it down and reshape it. If it does not rise enough, your morning baking will fail. And in the morning, you wake before anyone else. You punch down the risen dough, shape it into loaves, let it rise again, and then bake it. The entire process from evening mixing to morning eating takes 12 to 16 hours. 12 to 16 hours of your attention, your labour, your expertise, for bread, just bread. Now multiply that by everything else that needed to be prepared. Butter needed to be churned, a process that could take an hour or more. Milk needed to be separated, cream rising to the top overnight, which you would skim off in the morning. Vegetables needed to be prepared for the next day's meals. Meat needed to be protected from spoilage. In summer, that meant storing it in the coolest part of the house or even hanging it in a well. In winter, it meant keeping it cold but not frozen. And if it was preserving season, late summer and fall when fruits and vegetables were abundant, the evening work could stretch until midnight or later. Let me tell you what canning involved, because this is a perfect example of work that was both essential and exhausting. First, you needed to pick or purchase the produce. Then you needed to prepare it, washing, peeling, cutting. Then you needed to prepare the jars, sterilizing them in boiling water. Then you needed to pack the jars, add preserving liquid, syrup for fruits, brine for vegetables, and seal them. Then you needed to process the jars in boiling water for a specific amount of time to kill bacteria and create a seal. The entire process for a batch of canned goods could take 6 to 8 hours, and you could not do this casually. If you failed to sterilize properly, the food would spoil. If you failed to seal properly, bacteria would get in. If you failed to process long enough, harmful microorganisms would survive. And botulism, a deadly form of food poisoning, was a real risk. Women learned to check their canned goods obsessively. A bulging lid meant spoilage. A strange smell meant danger. You opened each jar with a little prayer that you'd done it right, that your family would not get sick, that the food would last through the winter. Can you imagine that responsibility? Your family's survival through winter depends on your skill at preserving summer's abundance. If you mess up, people go hungry. If you really mess up, people might die. And you are doing this work in the evening after a full day, by lamplight, with tired hands and an aching back. Here is a detail that captures the relentlessness of this work. In rural areas, there was something called putting down eggs. Eggs were abundant in spring and summer when hens laid prolifically, but scarce in winter when hens stopped laying. So women would preserve eggs in late summer, coating them in a mixture of water glass, which is sodium silicate, and water. This created a seal that kept the eggs fresh for months, but it had to be done right. The eggs had to be absolutely fresh. The water-glass mixture had to be the right concentration. The container had to be sealed properly. Women would spend evenings in August and September preserving hundreds of eggs so their families would have protein through the winter. And they did this while also preserving vegetables, fruits and meat. and while also doing all the regular cooking, cleaning and childcare, and while also doing needlework, letter writing and all the other evening activities we have discussed. I want to pause here and acknowledge something. I have been describing middle-class and working-class women's labour. Wealthy women had servants who did most of this work, but even wealthy women had to manage and supervise. They had to plan menus, order supplies, train servants, and ensure everything ran smoothly. The mental load was still significant, and many wealthy women did participate in preserving and cooking, particularly for special occasions or delicate tasks that required personal attention. Now here is where it gets interesting. Evening cooking and preserving created a particular kind of expertise. This was not book knowledge. This was embodied knowledge passed down through generations. Your grandmother taught your mother, who taught you. And it was precise, sophisticated knowledge based on observation, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom. For example, women could judge the temperature of an oven by how long they could hold their hand inside. 5 seconds meant one temperature, 10 seconds meant another. They could tell if bread dough had the right consistency by how it felt in their hands. They could tell if fruit was at the perfect stage for preserving by its smell, its colour, the way it yielded to pressure. They could tell if milk was starting to turn by a subtle change in odour that modern noses would miss entirely. This was expertise, real, valuable, sophisticated expertise, but it was dismissed as just women's work, just cooking, just housekeeping, not important, not intellectual, not worthy of respect or compensation. And that dismissal is one of the great injustices of history, because the knowledge required to feed a family year-round without refrigeration, without grocery stores, without any of our modern conveniences, that knowledge was profound. It was chemistry, biology, physics, and art all combined, and it was being lost. As industrialization progressed, as food became available in stores, as canning moved from home to factory, as refrigeration became possible, this knowledge started to disappear. By the mid-20th century, most women could not do what their great-grandmothers did routinely. They could not preserve food for months. They could not manage a sourdough starter. They could not judge oven temperature by hand. The skills were gone. Some people celebrate this as liberation, and in many ways it was. Women were freed from hours of exhausting labour. They could pursue education, careers, interests beyond the kitchen. That freedom matters. That freedom is real. But we also lost something. We lost the connection to our food. We lost the understanding of where it comes from, how it is made, what it requires. We lost the seasonal rhythms, the abundance of harvest, the scarcity of winter, the careful management that made survival possible. We lost the competence, the self-sufficiency, the knowledge that we could feed ourselves no matter what, and we are starting to feel that loss. The current interest in bread baking, in fermentation, in canning, in homesteading, these are attempts to reclaim some of what was lost. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when supply chains faltered and grocery stores had empty shelves, people suddenly wanted to know how to make bread from scratch, how to preserve food, how to be less dependent on industrial systems, and they discovered it was harder than they thought, because that knowledge once lost is not easily regained. Let me share one more detail that I find both beautiful and heartbreaking. In many households there was a kitchen diary or household book where women recorded recipes, but more than that, they recorded which preserves were made each year, when they were opened, how long they lasted. They recorded which methods worked and which failed. They recorded special techniques, family secrets, adaptations for different conditions. These books were treasures, passed from mother to daughter, filled with handwritten notes, stains from actual use, annotations from multiple generations. And most of them are lost, thrown away when the owner died, deemed worthless by heirs who did not cook that way anymore. discarded as clutter during moves or cleanings. The knowledge they contained, gone. The record of women's expertise, erased. But some survive. Museums and archives have started collecting them. Historians study them. And what they reveal is astonishing. The sophistication of food preservation techniques, the creativity in adapting to scarcity, the meticulous record-keeping, the scientific precision combined with artistic flair. These were not simple housewives following simple recipes. These were experts managing complex systems with limited resources and high stakes. As the evening finally truly ends, as the bread dough is set to rise, as the preserved food is stored away, as the kitchen fire is banked, as the lamp is finally extinguished, a woman might take a moment before heading to bed. Just a moment to stand in the dark kitchen, feeling the ache in her shoulders, the calluses on her hands, the exhaustion that is now so familiar it is almost comforting. And she knows she will do this all again in a few hours. The bread will need baking, the meals will need preparing, the work will never end. But she also knows her family will eat. They will have bread with breakfast. They will have preserved fruit with dinner. They will survive another day because of her labour, her knowledge, her midnight hours in the kitchen, and there is pride in that. Quiet, unspoken pride. Not the kind that gets rewarded or celebrated, but the kind that sustains you when everything else feels overwhelming. And as she finally climbs the stairs to bed, as she passes through the house checking on sleeping children one last time, she carries something we have almost entirely lost. The deep satisfaction of having done necessary work well, of having used your hands and your knowledge to create something essential, of being competent, capable, indispensable. But wait, because we have been exploring women's evenings room by room, activity by activity, and there is one space we have not yet entered. One activity that combined all the threads we've been following: community, creativity, culture, education, empowerment. I am talking about the salon, the literary society, the women's club, those formal evening gatherings where women did not just sew or pray or cook. They read papers, they debated ideas, they created intellectual culture. They taught each other and learned from each other in ways that shaped nations and movements, and that world, that powerful, transformative world of evening intellectual life, that is where we need to go next, because it is there that we will see the full power of what women could create when they gathered with intention and without male oversight. Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock, but this is not a typical Tuesday. Tonight, Elizabeth is hosting the Literary Society. She has spent the afternoon preparing, not cooking elaborate food, though there will be tea and cakes. No, she has been preparing her paper, the one she will read aloud to 15 other women who will then discuss it, critique it, challenge it, and help her refine her thinking. Because this is not a social visit. This is not a quilting bee. This is an intellectual gathering. And in this room tonight, women will do something revolutionary. They will think, they will debate, they will claim their right to ideas, and they will do it without asking any man's permission. Welcome to the world of women's literary societies, book clubs, salons, and evening intellectual culture. This is where women created their own universities, their own publishing networks, their own systems of knowledge production and exchange. And it is one of the most subversive, powerful, and underappreciated aspects of women's evening life before television. Because while men had universities, professional societies, and gentlemen's clubs, women had this. Secret schools hidden in plain sight, revolutionary organizations disguised as tea parties, training grounds for leaders, thinkers, and activists who would change the world. Let me take you inside. The women arrive between 7 and 8. They're dressed nicely, but this is not a formal event. They bring notebooks, pencils, books. They settle into chairs arranged in a circle or around a large table. There is chatting, certainly, news is shared, children's health is discussed, mutual friends are mentioned, but there is also anticipation, because tonight's topic is announced in advance. Maybe it is discussion of a specific novel, maybe it is a paper on a historical subject, maybe it is a debate on a current political issue. Whatever it is, these women have come prepared to engage intellectually. The meeting is called to order. In many societies there is a formal structure. A president presides. A secretary keeps minutes. There are rules of order: who speaks when, how disagreements are managed, how decisions are made. These are not casual gatherings. These are organized institutions with constitutions, bylaws, and procedures. And that structure is important. It teaches women how to run meetings, how to govern organizations, how to lead. Skills they are forbidden from using in public life. Skills they practice here in the evening in private homes. Someone, maybe Elizabeth, stands to read her paper. And here is what you need to understand. These papers were serious scholarly work. Women researched historical topics, analysed literary works, examined scientific questions, and discussed political issues. They cited sources, they built arguments, they presented evidence, and their audiences listened critically, asked questions, and demanded intellectual rigour. I am not exaggerating. Let me give you a specific example. In the late 1800s, women's clubs across America organised study programs that lasted years. One club might spend an entire season, September through May, studying the history of England. Members would divide the topic, with each woman responsible for presenting on a specific period or aspect. They would read multiple books, take notes, and synthesize information into original presentations. The next season might be devoted to Shakespeare. The season after that to the women's suffrage movement or to the science of nutrition. By the time a woman had been in such a club for 10 years, she had received an education equivalent to several university courses. Except she had no degree, no credential, no official recognition, but she had the knowledge, she had the intellectual training, and she had the confidence that comes from presenting your ideas to peers who respect you. Now, where did these societies come from? The roots go back to the 18th century. In France, salons were gathering places where intellectuals, writers, and thinkers would meet, often in the homes of wealthy women to discuss ideas. These salons were famously hosted by women like Madame de Staël, who influenced political and literary culture across Europe. The salon was a woman's space where she could exercise intellectual authority. This model crossed to England and America, but it evolved. Because middle-class women could not host the kind of aristocratic salons that existed in Paris. So they created something different. Book clubs, literary societies, study groups. More democratic, more structured, more accessible. You did not need a mansion or a title. You just needed a parlour, some friends, and a commitment to learning. And these groups exploded in the 19th century. By the 1870s and 80s, nearly every town of any size had multiple women's literary societies. Some were exclusive, you had to be invited to join. Others were open to any woman willing to pay small dues and attend regularly. But all of them shared a common purpose: to create space for women's intellectual development in a world that systematically denied them education. Let me tell you about one specific organization that captures this perfectly. The Cirrhosis Club, founded in New York City in 1868, was created specifically because women were excluded from a dinner honoring Charles Dickens. Women journalists who had covered Dickens's work were not allowed to attend because it was a men's-only event. So they said, "Fine, we will create our own club." And they did. Cirrhosis became one of the most influential women's clubs in America. Members included journalists, writers, educators, and activists. They met every other Monday evening. They discussed literature, science, art, current events, and they explicitly rejected the idea that women's clubs should focus only on charitable work or domestic topics. They claimed the right to discuss anything that interested them: politics, economics, international affairs, whatever they wanted. And here is what makes this radical. In doing so, they were claiming that women's minds were capable of engaging with complex ideas. That seems obvious to us now, but in the 1800s, the dominant view was that women were intellectually inferior to men, that their brains were smaller, their reasoning capacity limited, their proper sphere restricted to home and family. Women's literary societies were a direct challenge to that ideology. They were proving through their actions that women could think, analyse, debate, and create knowledge just as well as men. But it was not always easy. Some women faced opposition from husbands who did not want their wives attending evening meetings. Some communities viewed literary societies with suspicion. Were these women becoming too educated, too independent, too opinionated? There were real social costs to participating. Women had to navigate carefully, presenting their clubs as harmless, domestic, feminine, while actually using them to develop skills and knowledge that were anything but conventional. And the clubs were strategic about this. They would frame their activities in acceptable terms. Studying history, that helps us educate our children better. Discussing literature, that improves our moral character. Analysing social problems, that informs our charitable work. The framing was traditional, the content was subversive. Now let me tell you what happened in these meetings beyond the formal programme, because the social time before and after presentations was just as important as the structured content. This is where women shared information networks. Who is hiring? What jobs are available? My daughter needs a teaching position. Does anyone know of openings? My sister wants to start a business. Does anyone have advice or contacts? Literary societies became informal job networks, business incubators and support systems. A woman who presented a paper on economics might be approached afterward by another member who wanted to start a cooperative. A woman who discussed suffrage might find herself recruited into political organising. Ideas led to action. Intellectual engagement led to real-world change, and the writing that women produced in these societies often found its way into the world. Some clubs published their papers in local newspapers. Some compiled them into books. Some women used their club presentations as the foundation for articles or lectures delivered to broader audiences. The literary society was a testing ground, a place to develop your voice before going public. Let me share a specific example of how powerful this could be. Many of the women who became leaders in the suffrage movement were trained in literary societies. They learned public speaking by presenting papers. They learned debate by discussing controversial topics. They learned organisation by running club meetings. When they entered the public sphere to demand voting rights, they already had years of practice in exactly the skills they needed. The literary society was their political education. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all of them participated in women's literary and intellectual societies before becoming famous activists. And when they organised the women's rights movement, they used the same structures they had learned in evening clubs. Formal meetings, written resolutions, parliamentary procedure. These were not invented from scratch. These were adapted from the literary society model. Now, not all literary societies were explicitly political. Many focused on purely cultural or educational topics. But even these had political implications, because a woman who spent 10 years studying philosophy, history, and science is not the same as a woman who's been denied education. Knowledge changes you. It changes how you see the world, how you understand your place in it, how you assess claims made by authorities. Educated women were harder to control, harder to dismiss, harder to keep in subordinate positions, and men noticed. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a backlash against women's clubs. Critics called them frivolous, or dangerous, or both, somehow. Women were accused of neglecting their homes and families to attend meetings. They were mocked for pretending to understand subjects beyond their capacity. They were warned that too much education would damage their reproductive health. This was actually a popular claim. The uterus and the brain could not both function at high levels simultaneously, doctors claimed. Study too hard and you would become sterile. This is absurd, of course, but it reveals the threat that educated women posed. If women could think as well as men, the entire justification for their subordination collapsed. So the existence of women's literary societies had to be either dismissed as meaningless or attacked as dangerous. It could not be acknowledged as what it was, a legitimate educational and intellectual movement. But women persisted, and by the early 20th century, women's clubs had evolved into powerful civic organizations. They lobbied for public libraries, for educational reform, for child labor laws, for public health initiatives. They raised money for scholarships, for hospitals, for social services. The Evening Literary Society had grown into a force for social change, and then gradually it declined. Why? Several reasons. As women gained access to formal education, colleges and universities began admitting women in significant numbers by the early 1900s. The need for self-education decreased. If you could get a degree, why spend your evenings in a literary society? As women entered professions, they had less time for volunteer intellectual work. And as other forms of entertainment became available, movies, radio, and eventually television, the appeal of sitting in a circle discussing Browning's poetry diminished for many women. But the legacy remains. The modern book club is a direct descendant of the 19th century literary society. The women's professional networks, the feminist reading groups, the community education programs, all of these trace their lineage to those evening gatherings in parlours and libraries where women claimed their right to think. And some clubs never stopped. There are literary societies founded in the 1800s that still meet today, still reading papers, still discussing ideas, still maintaining the tradition of women gathering to engage their minds together. These are living connections to a past when such gatherings were revolutionary acts. As Elizabeth finishes reading her paper on the role of women in the Renaissance, as the discussion begins and voices rise in passionate debate about whether women had agency or were merely pawns in male power structures, as someone challenges Elizabeth's interpretation and she defends it with evidence and logic, something important is happening. These women are practicing democracy. They are practicing scholarship. They are practicing leadership, and they are doing it together, supporting each other, learning from each other, building something larger than any individual could build alone. And when the meeting ends, when coats are gathered and good nights are said, when women step out into the evening air and head toward their separate homes, they carry with them not just the specific knowledge from tonight's discussion. They carry confidence. They carry connection. They carry the experience of being taken seriously, of having their ideas matter, of being part of a community of minds. But the evening gatherings we have explored, the reading, the sewing, the praying, the cooking, the studying, all of these happened within a framework of social expectation and social performance. And one of the most complex and elaborate forms of that performance was the evening social call, the ritual of visiting and being visited, the intricate dance of social connection, status negotiation, and relationship maintenance that happened in parlours across the country every single evening. And that world, with its calling cards and visiting hours and unspoken rules, that is territory we must map carefully, because it reveals how women navigated social hierarchies, built alliances, managed reputations, and wielded the soft power that was often their only power. So let us step into that parlour now, as the doorbell rings and the first caller arrives. The doorbell rings at precisely 3 o'clock, not 2:45, not 3:15, 3 o'clock. Because Mrs. Hartford knows the rules. Thursday is Mrs. Bennet's at-home day, and proper calls occur between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. But here is the thing, afternoon calls are just the beginning. Because in many households, evening visiting is where the real social work happens. The strategic alliances, the careful negotiations, the delicate dance of status, reputation and power that women navigated every single week. And if you think this sounds exhausting, you're absolutely correct. It was exhausting. It was also essential. Because in a world where women had little formal power, social connection was currency, and the evening parlour was the stock exchange. Let me explain how this worked, because the system was Byzantine in its complexity. First, you need to understand that there were different types of visits with different rules, different expectations, and different social meanings. The afternoon call was formal, short, scripted, performative. But evening visits, those could be intimate, extended, meaningful, or they could be elaborate social theatre where every gesture was calculated and every word was measured. It depended entirely on the relationship and the purpose. Here is the basic framework. If you were in someone's social circle, you were expected to visit them regularly. Not daily, but perhaps once every 2 or 3 weeks. And they were expected to visit you with similar frequency. This reciprocity was crucial. If you visited someone and they did not return the visit within a reasonable time, usually within a week or 2, that was a social statement. They were cutting you, declining the relationship, and everyone would notice. Now, evening visits had particular characteristics that differentiated them from afternoon calls. Evening visitors were usually closer friends or family. You did not make formal evening calls on casual acquaintances. Evening was for people you actually wanted to spend time with. The visit might last 1 to 3 hours. You might stay for tea or light refreshments. You might engage in activities together. Needlework, reading aloud, playing music, conversing. This was social time that blended friendship with cultural activity. But even among friends, there were rules. You did not arrive too early. That suggested you were presuming too much intimacy. You did not stay too late. That suggested you were oblivious to social cues. You dressed appropriately, nice enough to show respect. Not so formal that you seemed to be performing rather than visiting. You brought small gifts sometimes, flowers, preserves, books, but not expensive gifts, which would create uncomfortable obligation. Every choice was freighted with meaning. And then there were the calling cards. Oh, the calling cards. These small pieces of engraved cardstock were the social media of the Victorian era, and the rules surrounding them were absurdly elaborate. Let me give you just a taste. A married woman had her own card and also carried her husband's cards. When making a call, she would leave one of her cards and 2 of her husband's, one for the lady of the house and one for the gentleman, unless the household had multiple unmarried daughters, in which case she might leave additional cards. Or if she was calling on a newly married couple, different rules applied. The combinations were endless, and the corner of the card mattered. If you folded down the upper right corner, that meant you had called in person, but the person was not at home. If you folded the upper left corner, that meant congratulations. Lower right meant condolence. Lower left meant goodbye. You were leaving town. People actually did this. They actually spent mental energy remembering which corner signaled which message. Now here is where it gets really interesting. The calling card system was not just about communication, it was about control. Because who you left cards for, who you accepted cards from, whose cards you returned, all of this determined your social position. You could strategically not return someone's card, thereby excluding them from your circle. You could leave a card at someone's house knowing they were home, but not actually requesting to see them. This was called a formal call, and it maintained the appearance of social connection without actual friendship. and women managed this system. Men had calling cards and made calls, certainly. But women were the primary architects and enforcers of social networks. They decided who was in and who was out. They determined which families were acceptable and which were not. They built alliances, settled grudges, elevated proteos, and destroyed reputations, all through the medium of visiting and cards. Let me tell you about the psychological toll of this. Imagine you are a middle-class woman trying to maintain or improve your social position. Every week you must keep track of who you owe visits to, who has visited you that you must visit back, who has sent cards that require a response. You must monitor the social landscape constantly. Did the Smiths visit the Joneses? If so, what does that mean for your relationship with both them families? Is there a new family in town that you should call on? Is there a family you've been calling on that is now considered déclassé, and should you gradually withdraw? This was work, unpaid, unacknowledged, but absolutely essential work. Because your family's social position, and by extension, their economic opportunities, their marriage prospects, their reputation, depended on your skill at navigating this system. A woman who was good at social management could elevate her family. A woman who made missteps could damage them. The stakes were real. And it was not just about status. Social visiting was also how information travelled. Who is hiring? Who is selling property? Who is engaged? Who is sick? Who is in financial trouble? The evening parlour was the news network, the gossip channel, the intelligence service. Women who were well connected knew everything that was happening in their community, and knowledge was power. But let me balance this by saying, not all evening visits were calculated social positioning. Many were genuine friendship. Women who liked each other would arrange evening visits specifically because they enjoyed each other's company. They would talk freely, laugh together, share confidences. These visits were relief from the performance of daily life. They were authentic connection in a world that demanded so much pretense. And some evening visits were specifically for support during crisis. If someone in the family was ill, friends would visit in the evening to sit with the sick person, giving the primary caretaker a break. If someone had died, the evening visiting would intensify, people bringing food, offering help, providing company during grief. If a woman had just given birth, other women would visit to check on her, bring small gifts, share advice. The social visiting system, at its best, was a mutual aid network. Now, working-class women had their own visiting patterns that were less formal but equally important. They might drop by a neighbour's house in the evening to borrow something, returning it the next day and staying to chat for a while. They might organise informal evening gatherings where several families would squeeze into one small parlour, children playing underfoot while adults talked. These visits were less about status and more about survival, sharing resources, watching each other's children, providing emotional support in hard lives. But even in working-class visits, there were rules. You did not overstay your welcome. You offered to help with tasks if you visited during work hours. You reciprocated hospitality even if you had less to offer. The specifics were different, but the underlying principle was the same. Social connection required maintenance, and visiting was how you maintained it. Here is something that might surprise you. The decline of evening visiting was lamented even as it happened. People in the early 20th century wrote nostalgically about the old days when neighbours visited each other regularly, when parlours were full of conversation and connection. They worried that the telephone was killing visiting. Why go to someone's house when you could just call them? They worried that automobiles were killing visiting. People drove to other parts of the city for entertainment instead of walking to neighbours' homes. And they were right. Visiting did decline. By the mid-20th century, The elaborate system of calls and cards had almost entirely disappeared. People still visited friends, obviously, but the formality, the reciprocity, the social meaning, that was mostly gone. We gained privacy and freedom. We lost a structure that forced connection even when it was inconvenient. And you know what? We feel that loss. The loneliness epidemic we talk about today, part of that is the absence of structures that required us to show up for each other. Nobody is obligated to visit you now. Nobody has to maintain reciprocal social connection. We can all retreat into our separate homes, our separate screens, our separate lives. And many of us do. We have never been more able to avoid people, and we've never been lonelier. The evening visiting system, for all its flaws, and it had many, created enforced community. It pushed people together. It required you to make time for relationships, even when you were tired, even when you would rather be alone, even when the relationship was more obligation than pleasure. And sometimes that enforcement was exactly what people needed. Let me share one more detail that captures both the beauty and the burden of this system. In some communities, women kept visiting books where they recorded every visit: who came, when, how long they stayed, what was discussed. These books were part social diary, part strategic planning document. They helped women remember who they owed visits to and track the frequency and quality of social connections. Some of these books survive in archives, and reading them is fascinating. You can see patterns. This woman visited weekly. That woman came only for major events. This group of women formed a tight cluster of mutual visiting. That woman was isolated, receiving few visits and making fewer. These books are maps of social networks before we had that language. They show who was connected to whom, who had power, who was marginal. They reveal the hidden architecture of community, and they show how much labour went into maintaining that architecture. Every visit represented time, energy, emotional work, and women did that work, week after week, year after year, because it mattered, because connection mattered, because community mattered. As the evening visit winds down, as the final good nights are said and the visitor steps out into the night air, as the hostess closes the door and begins the work of tidying the parlour, there is a complex mix of feelings: relief that the performance is over, satisfaction if the visit went well, anxiety if something seemed off, pleasure if genuine connection happened, fatigue because entertaining even casually requires energy, and already mentally planning the return visit. When should it happen? What should be served? What topics should be discussed? This is the constant background hum of social management, the mental load that women carried as they navigated the intricate web of obligation, expectation, and connection that held communities together. But the day is not quite finished. The social obligations have been met, yes, the performance has been executed. But before a woman could truly rest, before she could climb those stairs and surrender to sleep, there was one more gathering that called to her, one more ritual that brought the household together not for society's sake, but for the soul's sake. The lamps would be trimmed, the family would assemble once more, and in the flickering light of the evening fire, they would turn their thoughts towards something larger than themselves, something eternal. Let us follow them into that sacred space where faith and family intertwined every single night. The parlour door closes behind the last visitor. Mrs. Bennet sets the calling cards on the hall table and pauses, her hand resting briefly on the polished wood. The performance is over, but the evening is not, because now comes the ritual that every Christian household in America, in England, across the Protestant world, observes without fail. The gathering that is not optional, not negotiable, not something you do when you feel like it. We are talking about family devotions, evening prayers, the nightly assembly where everyone, father, mother, children, sometimes servants, comes together to read scripture, to pray, to acknowledge their dependence on God before surrendering to the vulnerability of sleep. And if you think this was simply a quaint religious custom, a brief moment of piety, you're missing the profound complexity of what was actually happening. Because evening devotionals were not just theology, they were psychology, they were education, they were power negotiation, they were emotional processing, they were community building, they were sometimes resistance and revolution disguised as prayer. These 30 minutes shape the inner lives of millions of women in ways we can barely comprehend today. Let me take you inside a typical evening in 1870 in a middle-class home in Boston. The family has finished supper. The dishes have been cleared and washed. The younger children are already in their nightclothes. And now, at precisely 8 o'clock, the family gathers in the parlour. Not because they particularly feel spiritual at this moment, not because everyone is in a pious mood, but because this is what families do. This is as mandatory as eating, as expected as breathing, as regular as the turning of the earth. Father takes his place in the chair near the oil lamp. Mother sits across from him, the baby drowsing in her lap. 3 older children arrange themselves on the sofa. The oldest daughter, home from her teaching position, sits near the window. Even the hired girl slips in from the kitchen and takes a seat near the door. Everyone is present. Everyone is quiet. The transition from evening activity to devotional time is marked by this collective settling, this shared intake of breath. Father opens the family Bible, and you need to understand what this object represents. This is not a personal Bible you carry to church. This is the family Bible, massive, leather-bound, weighing perhaps 7 pounds. The front pages contain handwritten genealogy going back 3 generations, birth dates, marriage dates, death dates. This Bible is the family archive, the official record of lineage and legacy. Opening it connects this moment to all the moments that came before, to all the ancestors who sat for their own devotionals, to the long chain of faith stretching backward into history. Father reads, "Tonight he has chosen Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The King James language flows through the room, archaic even then, but deeply familiar. These are words that have been read in this house every week for as long as the children can remember. The rhythm, the cadence, the poetry of it. This becomes the soundtrack of childhood. And here is what you need to understand. This nightly Bible reading was not just spiritual practice, it was education. It was literacy training. It was cultural transmission. A child who sat through family devotionals from age 5 to age 18 would hear the entire Bible multiple times. They would absorb the language without trying. The parables, the psalms, the commandments. These would become the foundational texts of their worldview, the reference points for understanding everything else they encountered in life. After the reading comes interpretation, and this is where the dynamics become fascinating. Theoretically, Father is supposed to lead this discussion. He is the head of household, the spiritual authority. But here is the reality. Many men were not comfortable with this role. They could read the words fine, but theological interpretation, making ancient scripture relevant to daily life, that required education, confidence, skill that many simply did not possess. And so, strategically, subtly, women stepped in. Watch how this happens. Father finishes reading and offers a brief comment. God provides for us as the shepherd provides for his sheep. True enough, but not particularly illuminating. Then Mother speaks. Her voice is gentle, deferential. "I was reading in Matthew Henry's commentary," she says, "and he suggested that this psalm was written when David was fleeing from Saul. So when it says, 'Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,' David was literally in danger. The comfort was real because the threat was real. Now the passage has context. Now it has depth. And notice her strategy. She attributes the insight to Matthew Henry, a male commentator, thereby maintaining the appearance that male authority guides the discussion even as her knowledge shapes it. This is how women exercised intellectual and spiritual authority in spaces that theoretically excluded them. One of the children speaks up. So God protects us even when we are scared. Mother nods. What do you think? Have you felt God's protection? A discussion unfolds. The children share thoughts. Father adds his perspective, now more confident because Mother has opened the path. Even the hired girl ventures a comment about trusting God during her voyage from Ireland. Everyone's voice matters in this circle. After discussion comes prayer. In this household, everyone prays. Father begins with a formal prayer, thanking God for daily blessings, asking forgiveness for sins, requesting guidance. His prayer follows a structure learned from his father, passed down like the Bible itself. Then Mother prays, and something shifts. Her voice is softer but more intimate. She prays for specific people by name, for Aunt Sarah who is ill with consumption, for the widow down the street struggling to feed her children, for her own children's moral development, for strength to fulfill her duties. Her prayer reveals what weighs on her heart, and everyone hears it. Everyone learns what their mother cares about, what she fears, what she hopes. Then the children pray one by one. The oldest prays for wisdom in her teaching work. The middle child prays for a friend who moved away. The youngest prays that his sore throat will heal. Each prayer is a window into a soul. What you pray for reveals what matters to you. This is vulnerability, emotional transparency in an era that had no vocabulary for such things. But in prayer, feelings could be named. Needs could be voiced. Even the hired girl offers a brief prayer, thanking God for this household, asking blessings on her family back in County Cork. Her voice trembles. Mother catches her eye and nods. This moment of inclusion matters. It may be the only time in her long workday when she is treated as an equal. Now let me show you how this same ritual played out differently across different households, because the variations reveal truths about class, denomination, and power. In wealthy households, devotionals might be elaborate. Perhaps a hired chaplain would lead the service. Perhaps hymns would be sung with piano accompaniment. Perhaps servants would attend but sit separately, maintaining rigid class divisions, even in prayer. In working-class households, devotionals were compressed. A mother might read one verse while children prepared for bed. A quick prayer, perhaps one hymn if they knew it. The structure existed, the acknowledgement that God must be addressed before sleep, but adapted to lives with less time, less energy, less access to education. In Catholic homes, the ritual took different forms entirely. Evening prayers might centre on the rosary. The family would kneel, often on hard floors because suffering brought you closer to Christ, and move through decades of Hail Marys together. And here is something crucial. The mother often led these prayers. The rosary was considered particularly appropriate for women to lead, connected as it was to Mary, the mother of Jesus. So in Catholic households, you might see more overt female religious authority than in Protestant homes. The repetition, the rhythm, the tactile sensation of moving beads through your fingers, this created meditative space. You could process the day's troubles while your lips formed familiar words. In Quaker households, evening devotionals consisted entirely of silence. The family would gather and sit in complete quiet, waiting for the inner light to speak. Anyone could break the silence if moved by the Spirit. But often 30 or 40 minutes would pass without a word. just sitting together, just being present with each other and with God. Can you imagine a modern family sitting in silence for 40 minutes every evening? No phones, no television, no distractions, just silence and presence. The discipline required, the eventual peace discovered. And in enslaved households, this is absolutely crucial. Evening prayer took on revolutionary significance. In the secret prayer meeting in the hush harbour hidden in the woods after dark, enslaved people could speak truths that would get them killed in daylight. They could pray for freedom. They could pray for justice. They could pray for deliverance. They could articulate their full humanity in God's eyes, even as the world denied that humanity. The evening prayer meeting became resistance, hope, spiritual survival. And it was often women who organised these gatherings, who taught the spirituals, who held communities together through faith when everything else had been stripped away. Historians have documented this extensively. Elderly formerly enslaved people interviewed in the 1930s described these secret meetings in vivid detail. They would wait until the master's house went dark. They would slip away to predetermined locations. They would turn pots upside down, believing this would trap sound. Then they would pray and sing with fervour born of deep need, existential desperation. Prayer as survival, prayer as resistance, prayer as the one thing that could not be taken. Let me bring us back to that Boston parlour because I want you to understand the psychological function this ritual served. Evening devotionals created a boundary between day and night, between chaos and rest. It was a decompression chamber, a structured way to process the day through a spiritual lens. Something went wrong. Pray about it. Feeling anxious. Pray about it. Grateful for a blessing. Pray about it. The devotional became a framework for emotional processing in a world with no therapists, no counsellors, no mental health support. For women specifically, this mattered enormously. Women were expected to maintain emotional control during the day, to be pleasant, agreeable, serene, to suppress anger, frustration, fear. But in evening prayer, they could express what they truly felt. They could pray for strength to endure a difficult marriage. They could pray for a wayward child. They could pray for their own doubts. Because it was framed as prayer, emotion was acceptable. Tears during devotions were piety, not weakness. This gave women an outlet for all the feelings that had to be contained every other hour. Here is something surprising. The decline of family devotionals was noticed and lamented even in the late 1800s. Religious leaders wrote worried articles. They gave sermons emphasizing its importance. They blamed busyness, modern entertainment, declining faith. And they were partially right. The practice was declining. But what these mostly male leaders did not acknowledge was how much labour the practice required and who performed it. Because devotionals did not magically happen. Someone had to organise them. Someone had to gather the family, sometimes over objections. Someone had to maintain Bibles, choose readings, ensure consistency. Someone had to create the atmosphere of reverence, enforce quiet when children got restless, smooth over tensions, and that someone was almost always the mother. Another item on her endless list: maintain the home, manage the social calendar, prepare meals, raise children, and ensure the spiritual health and eternal salvation of the entire family. The weight of that. But many women valued this role despite its burden, because leading devotionals gave them authority. Real authority. It gave them voice on matters of morals and meaning. It gave them purpose beyond domestic labour. They were not merely cooking and cleaning. They were shepherding souls. They were building character. They were connecting their families to the divine. That meant something. That felt significant in a world that told women they were insignificant. Sarah Josepha Hale understood this. Editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, the most influential women's magazine of the 19th century, she wrote extensively about mothers as spiritual leaders of homes. She argued that mothers, because of their innate moral superiority and intimate relationship with children, were natural spiritual guides. This was radical. She was claiming religious authority for women in an era when churches forbade women from speaking in services, from teaching men, from holding leadership positions. But in the home, the mother was the priestess. This became central to what historians call the cult of domesticity, or cult of true womanhood. It was double-edged. On one hand, it confined women to the domestic sphere, insisted they be pure and pious and submissive. On the other hand, it gave them enormous power within that sphere. It said, you may not vote, you may not own property, but you have moral power. You shape the next generation. You determine the spiritual health of your family and thereby the nation. Many women used that power strategically. They used devotionals to teach daughters about God-given worth and dignity. They used scripture to encourage sons to value compassion and justice. They chose passages depicting strong women like Deborah, Ruth, Esther. They subtly undermined harsher theological views. They planted seeds of reform, disguised as spiritual education. The evening devotional was a teaching moment. Women wielded it with intention. Now let me tell you about women's prayer circles, because beyond family devotionals, many women participated in women-only prayer groups meeting in evenings. These were extraordinarily powerful spaces, rooms full of women praying together, supporting each other, organizing social action that would change the world. The temperance movement, the campaign to ban alcohol that resulted in prohibition, was largely organized through women's prayer circles. Women gathered to pray for salvation of drunkards, for husbands to stop drinking, for laws protecting families from alcohol's destruction. They prayed for courage. Then they moved to action. They organized boycotts of saloons. They staged protests outside bars, singing hymns. They petitioned legislatures. They lobbied congressmen. The prayer circle was the organizing unit of one of the most successful social movements in American history. Similarly, the abolitionist movement was intertwined with women's prayer groups. Women gathered to pray for slavery's end, for enslaved people's liberation, for courage as they participated in dangerous resistance. Then they acted. They sewed quilts to sell at anti-slavery fundraisers. They wrote letters to politicians. They sheltered freedom seekers as part of the Underground Railroad. They attended abolitionist lectures. Prayer was not separate from action. Prayer was the foundation, the motivation, the spiritual fuel. And here is what is fascinating. These groups often met in evenings specifically because that was when women could escape. During the day, household responsibilities could not be abandoned. But in evening, after supper was served, after children were in bed, they could tell husbands they were going to prayer meeting. What husband could object? It was religious, pious, exactly what good Christian women should do. So the evening prayer circle became freedom, a space where women gathered without male supervision, where they could speak freely, where they could organize and strategize and build power, all under prayer's protective cover. Susan B. Anthony made some of her first public speeches at women's prayer meetings and quilting bees. These were training grounds, safe spaces where women learned to speak publicly, to articulate arguments, to persuade and inspire. Skills developed in prayer circles, organizational skills, public speaking, coalition building, became the foundation of the women's rights movement. The line from evening prayer meeting to Seneca Falls Convention is direct and clear. Let me share one more aspect often overlooked, the bedtime prayer with children. After family devotional ended, mothers would shepherd children upstairs. There, kneeling beside each bed, the child would recite a personal prayer, usually a simple rhyme, Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Pause on that. If I should die before I wake, children prayed this every night. They went to sleep contemplating possible death. This was normal, universal, considered appropriate for a 4-year-old. Because child mortality was real, children did die in the night, from scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, causes nobody understood. Infant mortality rates were staggering. In the 1800s, perhaps 1 in 5 children died before age 5, perhaps 1 in 3 before adulthood. Every parent knew this, so bedtime prayer was preparation, making peace with mortality, asking God for protection while acknowledging protection might not come, teaching children that death was always close, always possible, and the only defense was spiritual readiness. And the mother kneeling beside her child, hearing that prayer night after night, what did she feel? Relief each morning that child woke again? Constant low-grade anxiety? Exhausting vigilance? The emotional weight of parenting in an era of high child mortality is almost impossible to comprehend. But it was real, it were daily, and the bedtime prayer was where it lived, where it was acknowledged, where it was surrendered to God because nothing else could be done. Some mothers added their own prayers after the child's verse. They would pray over sleeping children, asking for health, safety, guidance. They would pray for wisdom to raise these souls well. They would pray for strength if the worst happened. These were private prayers whispered in darkened rooms, witnessed by no one except the child who was supposed to be asleep but often listened. Those children carried the memory of their mother's whispered prayers for the rest of their lives. Here is what you need to understand. Evening religious practices, family devotionals, women's prayer circles, bedtime prayers were not just spiritual activities. They were coping mechanisms, mental health interventions, community organizing tools, spaces of female authority, teaching moments, emotional processing systems, resistance and revolution disguised as piety, all simultaneously woven together in ways difficult to untangle because people did not separate spiritual from psychological from political. It was one integrated whole. When these practices declined throughout the 20th century, something profound was lost. Not necessarily faith. Plenty remained believers, but the structure, the ritual, the enforced regularity of communal reflection, the built-in moments of vulnerability and connection. We gained privacy and autonomy and freedom to skip prayer. We lost the framework requiring us to sit together every evening and acknowledge both our mortality and our dependence on each other. The prayers are finished. The Bible is closed and placed back on its shelf, heavy with history. Children's voices fade as they climb stairs, bedtime verses echoing in the quiet house. Mother moves through the parlour one last time, straightening cushions, banking the fire, her own whispered prayers rising like breath into darkness. Prayers for strength, for wisdom, for grace to face whatever comes. And as she follows her family upward, as she prepares for the final transition from wakefulness to sleep, there remains one last transformation, the most dramatic shift of all. Because everything we have explored, the needlework, the reading, the games, the visiting, the prayer, all of it was public, witnessed, performed for family or society. But now comes the truly private moment, the intimate rituals behind closed doors, the care of body and spirit, the shedding of corsets and conventions, the precious solitary minutes when a woman could finally just be herself before darkness claimed the day. The bedroom door closes with a soft click. Finally, after hours of social performance, of managing household duties, of leading prayers and shepherding children, this door represents something precious: privacy, solitude. The chance to shed not just the day's clothing, but the day's persona. Because here is what you need to understand about women's evening rituals before television, before electric lights, before modern conveniences. The most intimate, most revealing moments happened right here, in the last 30 minutes before sleep. And these private rituals tell us more about what it meant to be a woman than perhaps anything else we have explored. Let me take you into a bedroom in 1880. It is 9:30 at night. The house has quieted, children are asleep, the husband is perhaps reading downstairs or already in bed, and the woman stands before her mirror, candlelight flickering across her reflection, about to begin the elaborate process of preparing for sleep. You might think this would be quick, remove clothes, put on nightgown, climb into bed, but you would be spectacularly wrong, because a middle-class or upper-class woman in the Victorian era wore between 15 and 20 separate pieces of clothing during the day, and removing them, caring for them, and caring for her body underneath, this could easily take 45 minutes to an hour. Let us walk through this step by step, because the details matter. They reveal attitudes about bodies, about femininity, about what women endured in the name of respectability. First, she removes her outer dress. This might button up the back, which means she either needs help from a lady's maid or a very long button hook to reach the fastenings herself. The dress is heavy, perhaps 15 pounds of fabric, boning and trim. She carefully hangs it or lays it out to air. Dresses were not washed frequently. Water and soap were harsh on delicate fabrics, and the labour of washing was enormous. So dresses were aired, spot-cleaned and worn multiple times between washings. Next comes the bodice or waist, a separate, fitted top. Then the petticoats, usually 2 or 3 layers of them, each with its own buttons or ties. Then the bustle or crinoline cage that gave skirts their fashionable shape. By now, she has removed perhaps 20 pounds of clothing. She can breathe a little easier. But she is not done, not remotely. Now comes the corset, and I need you to really understand what this garment represented. The Victorian corset was not like modern shapewear. It was a rigid structure of steel or whalebone stays covered in fabric, designed to compress the waist to fashionably tiny dimensions, while pushing the breasts up and the hips out. Women aimed for waists of 18 to 22 inches. To achieve this, they laced the corset brutally tight. Breathing was shallow, eating large meals was impossible, bending at the waist was difficult. And women wore these contraptions for 12 to 16 hours every single day. The process of removing a corset was both relief and vulnerability. As the laces loosened, as the pressure released, the body could expand, could breathe fully for the first time since morning. Women described this moment in their private diaries. The physical relief was intense. But there was also shame, because without the corset, the body was soft, undefined, not meeting the fashionable ideal. The corset created the illusion of the perfect hourglass figure. Without it, most women felt their bodies were inadequate. And here is the thing that might shock you. The corset caused real documented physical damage. Doctors in the late 1800s wrote extensively about corset sickness, fainting spells, shortness of breath, digestive problems, displaced organs. An 1871 medical text documented that tight lacing could actually shift the position of the liver and compress the lungs. Women were literally deforming their internal organs in the name of fashion. Yet most continued wearing corsets because not wearing one was considered improper, immodest, evidence of loose morals. The corset was respectability made manifest in whalebone and lace. After the corset comes the chemise, a light undershirt, and then the drawers, which were actually 2 separate leg pieces tied at the waist, completely open at the crotch. This design made using chamber pots easier without having to fully undress, but it also meant that women's undergarments provided no real coverage or warmth. In winter, multiple petticoats were essential just to maintain body heat. Finally, she removes the last layer, and now she stands in her bedroom unclothed, vulnerable. This moment of nakedness was fraught with complex emotions. Because women were taught from childhood that their bodies were dangerous, shameful, something to be hidden and controlled, nakedness was associated with sin, with sexuality, with loss of virtue. Even in the privacy of her own bedroom, even alone, many women felt deeply uncomfortable with their own nudity. And yet this was also the moment when she could truly examine herself, could see her actual shape without the architectural engineering of corsets and padding, could touch her own skin, could assess whether that bruise on her ribs from the corset stays was getting worse, could notice the rash from wool rubbing all day, could simply exist in her body without mediation. Now begins the care routine, and this varied enormously depending on class and personal philosophy. Some women, influenced by medical advice of the era, believed that washing too frequently was unhealthy. They thought water weakened the body, made it vulnerable to disease. These women might wash only hands, face, and feet daily, with full baths taken perhaps weekly or even less frequently. Others, influenced by newer hygiene theories, believed in daily washing. They would use a basin and pitcher, kept in the bedroom, filling it with water carried up from the kitchen. The water was cold unless she had specifically requested hot water earlier, and someone, usually a servant or she herself, had hauled it upstairs. She would use a washcloth and soap to clean her face, her underarms, her private areas. The soap was often homemade, harsh, nothing like modern gentle cleansers. It might strip the skin, leave it tight and dry, or women used creamers afterward, cold cream, glycerin and rosewater, or formulas made from recipes passed down through families. Actresses and women of means might use more elaborate preparations. A cream containing lead and arsenic was popular for whitening the skin, despite the fact that these substances were literally poisoning users. Beauty standards demanded pale, translucent skin. Sun exposure was to be avoided at all costs, and women would use genuinely toxic substances to achieve that pallor. Hair care was its own elaborate ritual. During the day, hair was pinned up in complex arrangements. Now, finally, the pins could come out, and there were a lot of pins. Women might use 20, 30, 40 hairpins to create the fashionable pompadours and chignons of the era. Removing each pin was a small relief. The weight of the hair, the tension on the scalp, this had been present all day. Now it could be released. Once unpinned, the hair tumbled down. For many women, hair reached to the waist or beyond. It had never been cut, only trimmed. This hair represented femininity, beauty, virtue. Long hair was evidence of female nature. Short hair on a woman was scandalous, associated with illness, madness, or radical political views. So women maintained their long hair carefully, even though caring for it was tremendously labor-intensive. The nightly routine involved brushing. Not a quick brush, but 100 strokes as the advice manuals instructed. This distributed natural oils, removed tangles, stimulated the scalp. It was also meditative, rhythmic, a repetitive motion that allowed the mind to wander. Some women braided their hair for sleep to prevent tangling. Others left it loose. The choice was personal, private, one of the few decisions about her body that was entirely her own. Teeth care was rudimentary by modern standards. Some women used tooth powder, formulas made from chalk, charcoal, or even crushed brick. Others simply rinsed with water. Toothbrushes existed but were not universal. Dental hygiene was poor by modern standards, and many women lost teeth young to decay and disease. A woman in her 30s might already have gaps in her smile. A woman in her 50s might have lost most of her teeth entirely. Dentures were available but expensive and uncomfortable. This was just accepted reality. Now she puts on her nightgown, and even this garment carried meaning. A nightgown was supposed to be modest, covering from neck to wrist to ankles. It was usually made of white cotton or linen, loose-fitting, completely concealing the body's shape. Married women might have slightly more decorative nightgowns with a bit of lace or ribbon, but even these were fundamentally about modesty. The female body, even in sleep, was supposed to be hidden, controlled, made decent. Some women, particularly older women or those in cold climates, also wore nightcaps. These kept the hair tidy and the head warm in unheated bedrooms. Yes, unheated. Because most bedrooms had no source of heat. The fire downstairs was allowed to die down at night. Bedrooms were often brutally cold in winter. Women would use warming pans, metal pans filled with hot coals that were run between the sheets to warm the bed before getting in. They would pile on quilts, sometimes 5 or 6 heavy quilts, creating enormous weight pressing down all night. They would sometimes sleep in bed socks, anything to combat the cold. Before getting into bed, there was one more necessary task: the chamber pot. Because bathrooms as we know them did not exist in most homes. Indoor plumbing was rare until the late 1800s, and even then it was a luxury of the wealthy. Most people used chamber pots kept under the bed or in a cabinet. Women would use these before sleep, then cover them with a lid. In the morning, the contents would need to be carried downstairs and emptied into the privy or latrine. This was humiliating work, often assigned to the lowest-ranking servant. But in homes without servants, women did it themselves, just another unglamorous task in the endless cycle of domestic labour. Finally, she climbs into bed, and even this was different from our experience. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, horsehair, or feathers depending on wealth. They were lumpy, uneven, and required regular maintenance, turning, fluffing, sometimes completely restuffing. Sheets were linen or cotton, rough by modern standards. They were expensive enough that most families owned only 2 or 3 sets, which were washed infrequently because laundry was such brutal labour. And now, in this bed, in the darkness, in the silence, she was finally alone with her thoughts. This was perhaps the only time all day when she was not managing someone else's needs, not performing a role, not being watched or judged. This was the private self, unmediated. And what did women think about in these quiet moments? We know from diaries and letters that survived. Some women reflected on the day's events, processing interactions and decisions. Some worried about money, about children's health, about their husband's business, about their own aging parents. Some prayed silently, continuing the spiritual work begun in evening devotionals. Some allowed themselves to feel emotions that had been suppressed all day. Sadness, anger, loneliness, frustration. Some simply felt relief that the day was over, that they had survived it, that they could rest now. And some women used these private moments for something the Victorian era barely acknowledged: their own pleasure. Because here is a secret that history often glosses over. Women had sexual desires. Women touched their own bodies. Women experienced pleasure. They just could not talk about it, could not acknowledge it publicly. Medical texts of the era claimed women had no sexual feelings, or only the most refined and spiritual kind. Any woman who expressed actual desire was considered abnormal, possibly diseased. Masturbation was condemned as dangerous, unhealthy, evidence of moral failing, but private diaries, coded letters between women, later psychoanalytic case studies, all reveal that women's sexuality existed and was explored in secret. The bedroom at night alone was one of the only spaces where this was possible. It had to remain hidden, unspoken, shrouded in shame, but it existed nonetheless. For married women, this private bedtime routine might be interrupted by a husband's approach. Sex was understood to be a wife's duty. She was expected to submit to her husband's desires regardless of her own feelings. Advice manuals told women to endure marital relations without complaint, to view it as service as necessary for producing children and maintaining the husband's health and fidelity. The idea that a wife might enjoy sex, might desire it herself, was considered slightly scandalous. Pleasure was for men, duty was for women, and yet some marriages were genuinely affectionate. Some couples enjoyed physical intimacy together. Some women experienced pleasure even within the restrictive framework of Victorian sexual morality, but they could not speak about it openly, could not compare experiences with other women, could not learn what was normal or possible. Sexual knowledge was deliberately kept from women to maintain their purity. Ignorance was equated with innocence, and women paid the price in confusion, pain, and misconnection. As sleep approaches, there is one more ritual many women observed, a moment of reflection, of mental accounting. Some women kept diaries and would write a final entry for the day. These diary entries are treasure troves for historians because they reveal inner lives that were otherwise invisible. Women wrote about their frustrations with limited opportunities, their intellectual ambitions that had no outlet, their complex feelings about marriage and motherhood, their friendships with other women that were often the most emotionally sustaining relationships in their lives. Reading these 19th century diaries is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because you see brilliant, capable women confined by circumstances beyond their control. Inspiring because you see their resilience, their creativity in finding meaning and purpose despite constraints, their support of each other. These women were not passive victims. They were strategic actors, working within and sometimes against the systems that limited them. And then, finally, the candle is blown out. Darkness descends. The house settles into silence. And she sleeps, or tries to, because sleep was not always easy. Worry could keep her awake. Physical discomfort from the bed or the cold could prevent rest. Pregnancy, which for many women was a near constant state during their childbearing years, brought its own sleep disruptions. Nursing infants woke multiple times per night, and the mother was expected to tend them without help. But when sleep did come, it was deep and necessary, because the next day would bring the entire cycle again, the corset laced tight at dawn, the household duties stretching from morning until night, the social performances and emotional labour, the care of others before care of self, the endless, exhausting work of being a woman in an era that claimed to idealise women while actually restricting and controlling them. So what can we take from this journey through women's evening rituals? What does it tell us about our own time? I think several things. First, the structures that organised women's evenings before television were not inherently oppressive or inherently liberating. They were both. They provided community, skill development, spiritual support, and creative outlet. They also reinforced gender roles, limited opportunities, and subjected women to exhausting labour, both physical and emotional. Second, women were never passive. Even within the most restrictive systems, they found ways to exercise agency, to create meaning, to support each other, to push boundaries. The temperance movement, the abolition movement, the suffrage movement, all grew out of the supposedly domestic, supposedly apolitical spaces of evening prayer, circles, and quilting bees. Women used the tools available to them, even when those tools were limited. Third, we have gained and lost. We have gained so much. Freedom of movement, educational opportunities, legal rights, control over our own bodies and lives that our great-great-grandmothers could only dream of. We have also lost some things worth remembering. The regular rhythm of communal activities, the deep skill development that came from thousands of hours of practice, the face-to-face social networks that required maintenance and provided support. Fourth, the constant across time is this: Women's labour, both physical and emotional, has always been essential to society's functioning. It has also always been undervalued, underpaid, or completely unpaid. The woman spending 3 hours on needlework, or managing complex social networks, or leading family devotionals, or caring for her body in the brief privacy before sleep, she was doing work that mattered, work that held families and communities together, and that work deserves to be seen, acknowledged, honoured. As we close this exploration, as we step back out of those lamplight parlours and candle-lit bedrooms and return to our own time, I want you to carry this with you. Those women were not so different from us. They worried about their children, they navigated complex relationships, they sought meaning and purpose, they balanced competing demands on their time and energy. They found moments of beauty and connection amid the struggle. They were fully human, as complex and contradicted as we are. And perhaps their evening structures, for all their flaws, have something to teach us. Not that we should return to corsets and calling cards, absolutely not. But maybe we could reclaim some of the intentionality. Maybe we could create regular rhythms of creativity, of face-to-face connection, of spiritual reflection, of skill development. Maybe we could turn off the screen sometimes and actually make something with our hands, have an actual conversation, sit in actual silence. Maybe we could honour the wisdom embedded in those old rituals even as we reject their restrictions. The story of how women structured their evenings before television is ultimately a story about how humans create meaning in time, how we mark the transition from day to night, from public to private, from work to rest, how we use ritual and repetition to process our lives and connect with each other. Those women sitting by the lamplight, stitching quilts or reading aloud or praying together or preparing for sleep, they were doing the same thing we do when we scroll through phones or watch television or lie awake at night thinking. They were trying to make sense of their days, to find comfort and connection, to rest so they could face tomorrow. Their methods were different. Their constraints were different. But the fundamental human needs were the same. And by understanding their lives, we understand something about our own, about what we have inherited, what we have transformed, and what we might still learn from the past as we build our futures. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the lamplight evenings of our great-great-grandmothers. Thank you for seeing their lives with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment. Thank you for considering what their experiences might teach us about our own. The past is not a foreign country. It is the foundation we stand on. And these women, with their needles and their prayers, their calling cards and their corsets, their secret thoughts and their public performances, they are part of us. Their strength lives in us. Their struggles inform ours. Their victories made ours possible. So the next time you settle in for an evening, whatever that looks like for you, maybe take a moment to think about them, about the millions of women who sat in millions of parlours, creating beauty and meaning and community with whatever tools they had, about the resilience and creativity of the human spirit, about how far we have come and how much of the journey still lies ahead. Until we meet again for the next story, for the next exploration of how we became who we are, take care of yourselves, honour your own evening rituals, whatever they may be, and remember, you are part of a long, long line of women who have navigated this world with courage and grace. Their light still shines, and so does yours.